One beautiful sunny day in a village built long ago, people were working peacefully. Suddenly, the ordinary residents heard a loud rumbling and felt the earth shake, assuming that an earthquake had occurred somewhere nearby. The confused residents looked around and asked each other what it was. A woman who looked like a maid with a bucket of laundry held above her head was walking past a building with a security guard when she suddenly heard another loud noise and felt another earthquake. Putting the laundry down on the ground so as not to spill or dirty it again, the woman asked the man what the sound was. The frowning security guard waved his hand and said that it was not worth her attention, and, irritated but politely, asked the woman to continue on her way. But the middle-aged woman was not satisfied with this answer and rushed to the man to ask for more details, as the events clearly resembled an earthquake. Then the man, a little nervous, said that the young master Yu Hyun was in the middle of his walk. The woman was surprised by this information and said that it was complete nonsense. But after another tremor, the guard sighed heavily, opened the gate, and said that the woman could see for herself. In the middle of the courtyard stood a huge, fat young man in nothing but his pants, barely moving. Each of his steps was accompanied by rivers of sweat and another earthquake. Another heavy step, which was already difficult for him, became another defeat for the young man, and he fell with a thud. Seeing his master in such a state, the man instantly rushed to him. But instead of gratitude, he received a dose of anger because the young master had asked him not to come in. The guard awkwardly turned around and went back to his place. The young man, making an incredible effort, got up on his own, cursing his body. From such tension and effort, his pants even ripped, and white underwear was visible through a small crack. Despite the difficult situation, the young man's eyes showed determination. He could not lose, so he put titanic effort into every step he took. Yu Hyun took a deep breath, clenched his fist tightly, but continued to take steps that seemed mundane to some, but were a real feat for him. A mosquito flying nearby spotted a tasty morsel of food in the form of a giant man, landed on the boy's neck, sucked a few drops of blood from him, and thus weakened him. The young man fell to the ground, creating another wave of the earthquake. He was tired of his fate and his body, which barely moved and seemed to break down at the slightest provocation. He watched as his guard ran towards him, shouting anxiously, and thought that he had to overcome everything in order to save Murim. In fact, the young man's name was Jin Wigan. He had returned to the past to save Murim. At first glance, it seemed crazy because now everything looked quite calm and peaceful. But he knew that in the near future, Murim would be engulfed in chaos. A man appeared who united the unorthodox Murim and painted the central plain red with blood. All the sects united for the common goal of defeating the unknown evil, but they were defeated and completely destroyed. If you think about it, this man seemed incredible because uniting Murim was not something that everyone could do. But because of the chaos he caused, Jin Wigan lost his parents and was left alone in this world. He lived as he pleased, wandering the streets and getting into fights over conflicting views and just for the sake of it. But everything changed when he met his mentors. One day, the King of Swords, Nam Gung Song, himself reached out to help him. At that moment, he naively thought that his life was finally starting to improve, but that judgment was wrong. His training was more like torture than real training. The poor guy was tied upside down and tickled. They released a bunch of poisonous and angry snakes at him, while the boy's only weapon was a torch. They threw him into the water and tied stones to his legs, throwing swords at him that he could dodge. They left him alone in the cold weather and then roasted him over a fire. Since his so-called teachers wanted Jin Wigan to stop the predecessor of chaos, they did whatever they wanted with him. They said that the young man had to suffer because he was still young, and as a result, he got a good body. In the end, as a result of such hellish training, the boy mastered all the martial arts of his teachers. The masters gave him the task of finding the one who would bring chaos and destroying him. They told him that in their youth they were passionate young men, and he must unite them and teach them as they had taught him. This was the story of Vegan's return to the past, and he liked it because when he found and destroyed the minion of chaos, he would live in luxury and abundance for the rest of his days. But fate is a joker, and the young man found himself in a helpless body that could not even walk, let alone train. Yu Sung-hwan yelled at his friend, the imperial physician Chang Se-yono, to do something with his child. While the man stood and cried over the body of his frail son Wigan, now known as Yu Hyun, thought that he could not give up because he had gone through such hellish training for this, so he had to survive no matter what. The young man lay on the bed and coughed up blood. His father anxiously asked his son how he was feeling. The doctor had an idea and did something, but Sun Hwan grabbed him by the collar and started yelling at the doctor that he was a quack and that his son was in pain. Meanwhile, Hyun was mentally devising a plan of action. First of all, he needed to lose weight before the battle with his accomplice, and he also had to train in martial arts. An equally important part of his mission was to obtain pure ginseng before the henchmen of chaos did. The men argued in front of the patient. The doctor said that the boy had blood stagnation, and the young man mentally begged them both to shut up because they were distracting him from his thoughts. The doctor shouted that they should let the boy vomit blood, that it would make him feel better. Son Juan promised to execute him if it didn't work. The young man was thinking about when his accomplice had obtained the ginseng, whether it was 6 years ago or some other time, but it was difficult to calculate with the old men arguing in the background. The doctor reminded the man that they were friends and how dare he talk to him like that. He should be grateful to him for saving his son. But the father, on edge, grabbed the doctor by the collar again and continued to threaten him. Ignoring the quarrel between the men in the background, Hyun tried to remember how much time he had left and screamed in horror when he realized that he only had 6 months left. In an angry shout at the men who were distracting him, he called them old farts, which immediately stopped the argument. And while the doctor was in shock from such rudeness, the father rushed to hug his son, who had finally come to his senses. The young man quickly realized that the old man hugging him like a puppy was the father of the boy in whom he had been reborn. In his joy, the old man hugged his son so tightly that he squeezed him and prevented him from breathing. For some reason, Yu's son latched onto the doctor, who blushed despite assuring him that the young man would come to his senses. Suddenly, Hyun respectfully and politely addressed his father, who instantly turned into an angel and asked his son what he wanted. Rising with difficulty, the young man said he wanted to take a walk, which shocked his father. The loving father immediately ordered the servants to bring a 4-seater chair and towels for his son. 4 burly, muscular men entered the room with the luxurious chair. Their arm muscles were incredibly strong, otherwise they would not have been able to carry such a heavy young master. The boy was very surprised because he did not consider being carried outside to be a walk, so he said that he would prefer to walk on his own. Then his father immediately called his servant Hwang Chong, who helped Yeon get up and led him to the exit by the arm. The old man couldn't believe that his son was really walking, and the servant who was called for help didn't believe it until he saw it with his own eyes. Yoo Seong burst into tears when he saw this scene, because he had not seen Yoo Hyun walk for the last 10 years. Seeing his father's attitude, it was no wonder that his new body was in such a state. All the passers-by who saw the young master walking were incredibly surprised and delighted. The young man was mentally surprised by people's reactions. He thought it was not the time to rejoice when he was only taking 4 steps. Much more depended on him. If he did not remember the martial arts, all these people would simply die. For half a month, the young man overcame all physical obstacles and walked like a madman, but felt no change. It was time for the weigh-in. The young man was weighed against pigs. Yoo Hyun sat on one side of the scales, while Hwang Chong drove a herd of pigs onto the other. During the weighing, the rope with the pigs snapped from the load, but the young man did not move an inch. Then he flared up with anger because everything could end before it even began. He had spent so much energy to get here, and as a result, he would not be able to destroy that accomplice. Suddenly, he was struck by the thought that the henchman was just the nickname of the one who destroyed the Mers. The young man was frightened because he did not remember his name or anything else about him, including his face. His masters in the past had repeated this information to him until his ears bled, but now he could not remember anything. Yun Chong saw how irritated the young master was and, holding the piglet gently in his hands, said carefully that fat is usually quite difficult to get rid of. The man was fired up with the idea of helping his master and suggested starting by removing sugar from his diet. In addition, he proposed a diet with an emphasis on protein. If the young man continued to do cardio and strength training, he would be able to lose all the weight in a year. The young man did not hear him and was thinking about his own thoughts. Vegan tried to understand if he had lost his memories when he moved into this body, but he remembered everything else. He knew that the man would come to Anhui province for the chase ginseng anyway, so he decided to find him first and wait there. The young man assumed that without the mystical creature, his enemy would be weak. The boy was caught up in fantasies of how he would stand proudly before the minion of chaos and mock him for his weakness, while he himself, incredibly strong, would bring his opponent to his knees. Yun Chong was afraid that the young master had gone mad because if something went wrong, he would turn into a corpse. The man cautiously tried to get his master's attention, but Hyun was already deep in thought about how to destroy Anhoi's henchmen and prevent chaos from erupting. The end of the mission would be the beginning of a wonderful, carefree life for him. In his mind, the young man had already defeated everyone and saved everyone. He laughed like a madman with joy, as if his plan had already come true. The poor servant hugged the pig, and from the outside, it looked as if his master had finally gone mad from trying too hard to lose weight. The man ran at the speed of light to find the imperial doctor so as not to get in trouble for his untimely reaction. Yun didn't pay much attention to this. He was focused on the fact that in order to carry out his plan, he had to do something with his body. But 10 years would not be enough to change it if he just walked around mindlessly, so the young man decided to change his approach. Meanwhile, a servant was running towards him at full speed with the imperial physician, raising a cloud of dust and anxiously calling out the young man's name. The The young man looked closely at Chang Seong. He knew that the man had been chosen as the imperial physician before he turned 30 and had displaced all the talented and not-so-talented people. And at the age of 50, the man founded his own medical technique. The young man saw this man as his savior. When Chang Seong arrived, he immediately apologized because he thought that the young man's desire to take a walk was the first sign of madness, and he should have guessed that. The young man did not seem to listen to him and asked if he was the most talented doctor in the Central Plains. The confused man uncertainly confirmed this. So Hyun announced his request. He wanted to get medicine that would help him lose weight. He needed something that would help him lose a significant amount of weight in a month. For some reason, the man was surprised that the reason the young man was walking was his desire to lose weight. Looking up, Chang Seon said that it seemed that the problem was not in his head but in his heart, and he assumed that the young man was deeply affected by the rejection. The doctor shook the young man's hand and said that he had medicine that would help improve his condition if taken over a long period of time. The man was a little discouraged when he heard that the young man wanted to do it in 6 months, because it would take at least 3 years plus active sports. For these words, the man was slapped and called a fraud. Chang Sun admitted that he was a fool to think that it would work. He had a trump card up his sleeve and said that even though it was difficult for the young master to even walk, there were still options available. Skeptically looking at the Dr. Fraudster, the young man narrowed his eyes and asked what exactly this idea was. The next day, Hyun was taken to a waterfall for training, where they sought to use the floating properties of water. The young man was delighted at the prospect of soon being able to lose weight, and for this purpose, they would come here for training every day. But the servants, who had carried the young master here in a litter and were now lying exhausted on the ground, were not very happy when they heard that they would now have to take such a walk every single day. With the last of their strength, which was only enough for thoughts, they pondered what had happened to their master. Their life was better when he refused to get out of bed. It was even like hitting the jackpot until then. The boy carefully descended into the pond, dipping his feet in one at a time, and asked if he should go in completely. In the water, he felt that it was much easier to walk there and kept asking if he should go further. Suddenly, the bottom disappeared from under Yu Hyun's feet, and he began to sink deeper and deeper, unable to stay afloat. Yun Chong smiled as he watched his master drown because he thought the young master was playing in the water and was happy that he was growing up. Meanwhile, the young man was rapidly sinking to the bottom and shouting at his foolish servants to save him, wasting his last breath. The man still stood smiling and wondered why the young man was diving, thinking that he had a talent for seafaring. Suddenly, one of the porters suggested that the young master might be drowning because there was a sharp drop at the bottom of the lake, and if you didn't know about it, you could drown. Only then did the man realize what was happening. He ran closer and out of fear covered his face with his hands so as not to scream. Meanwhile, the young man, who was falling like a stone to the bottom, had already used up his last breath and lost consciousness from oxygen deprivation. In his delirium, he was like a spirit in the form of his old body, watching the hut where the woman was with her baby. Vegan realized that these were the early memories of Yu Hyun, in whose body he found himself at that moment. The baby was only 2 years old. Looking closely, he thought that when the young man was a baby, he looked quite cute, and he also realized that the woman must be his mother. She was covered in blood, coughing it up and covering her mouth with her hand, saying that her child must survive. The boy began to look around, expecting his old servant to finally save him. Meanwhile, the weakened woman holding her child in her arms began to cry and gradually lose consciousness, and eventually her soul left her body. The delusions still did not end, because the young man's adult body, which weighed probably more than 100 kilograms, was quickly approaching the bottom. Meanwhile, Hyun Chong stood on dry land, stamping his feet and crying, because he could not swim and therefore could not save his master. Suddenly, along with the young master, a woman emerged from the water gasping for air. She had strong arms and in general must have possessed considerable strength to pull the young man's huge body out of the water. The woman was obviously a servant, so the man asked her why she was alone and where her young mistress was. Wiping the water from her face, she said that her mistress, Chen He, had asked her to go first, and that it didn't matter now because Hyun Chong had to save his master first. Coming to his senses, the man immediately rushed to Hyun, trying to revive him and shake the water out of him. After all the adventures were over, the servant and the doctor knelt before the angry Yu-sun. The man asked them for an explanation before taking their lives. The man was burning with rage and his subordinates trembled, realizing the danger of their situation. Yun Chong immediately began to blame everything on the imperial doctor because he had suggested that the young master go swimming. The man looked at the traitor in surprise, thinking that they were friends. Yun Chiong reminded him once again that it was Chang Sion's idea and added that they had nothing in common. Then all of Yu Sung's anger fell on the doctor when he furiously uttered his name. The man, burning with rage, grabbed his sword and began to swing it. The tall servant standing nearby smiled slightly because he found the situation quite amusing. The frightened doctor began to appeal to the rationality of his former friend and now master, suggesting that they talk. But the man did not listen, and only shouted that his son had been put in danger. The servant standing nearby even grabbed Yu's son to prevent him from harming the doctor. In the midst of the quarrel, a beautiful girl entered the room and informed the master that she had returned. She reported that Hyun had lost consciousness. The servant who was holding the master begged the girl to be quiet because it was further irritating the loving father. Suddenly, she turned to the imperial doctor who had been treating the young man for the past 10 years and decided to ask his opinion on the matter. The man stood up abruptly and began to loudly accuse a certain Namgung clan of everything. Chang Xian said that the young man was in this state because of the Namgung clan, because he had refused him, so he was desperately trying to lose weight, and the doctor simply gave him some advice. At that moment, the father clutched his head, realizing what was really going on. Focused on his own anger, he completely forgot about his son's feeling. The girl abruptly intervened, saying that if the young man wanted to lose weight, he could be allowed to swim. It was not a problem because there were many other places to swim besides the stream. The girl smiled sincerely. Her name was Yu Jung-hai, and she was Yu Hyun's older sister. After the incident, the young man rested in his room. He thought that someone definitely should have saved him in that stream. Sighing heavily, the boy sat down. Despite the unfortunate incident, he now knew that the boy had grown up without a mother. This explained why his father loved him so much, because he had almost lost his son just as he had once lost his wife. Judging by his character, Yu Sung loved his wife madly, so he obsessively raised his son because he was afraid that he might disappear. Wigan was angry at Hyun, whose body he now inhabited, and called him a scoundrel because it was his fault that he could not move normally. Apart from fat, he had no muscles, and his joints barely moved. Suddenly, the door flew open and Yu Jung appeared on the threshold with the maid who had saved her brother. The boy almost asked who she was, but his head suddenly hurt because he realized that she was now his sister. She seemed incredibly beautiful to him, and he couldn't believe that she was really his sister. His sister's maid slowly approached the boy and, assuming that it was difficult for him to get up, offered her help. Hyun waved her away, not knowing that she had saved him, and said that it would be too difficult for her, because even Hwang Jung and other strong young men could barely manage it. But to his great surprise, she lifted him to his feet with surprising ease and told the young master that they could go. One bright day when Mr. Hyun was taken out for a walk, his porters were surprisingly cheerful and walked easily, humming a tune. The young man sat in his shelter and pondered, trying to understand why they were in such a good mood. When they brought him to the place, the young man cried out in surprise at what he saw and asked what was going on. There were many workers on the lawn carrying piles of stones around a huge hole. Hyun got out of his portable throne and, approaching the workers, asked what they were doing. Looking at the size and hard work, he inadvertently assumed that they were digging a huge grave for him. Suddenly, Hyun's sister, as beautiful and elegant as ever, appeared on horseback. She was happy that the work would soon be completed, and she would no longer have to go to the stream. After they finished carrying the stones, the workers began to fill the so-called grave with water. Then the young man understood everything, and Jung Hye confirmed that it was now his own swimming pool. After finishing the work, the workers surrounded the young master and looked at him as if he were an animal in a zoo, unable to believe their eyes because he had never walked before. They began to sincerely congratulate him. The young man thanked them, of course, but he found it strange that they were celebrating his mere arrival. What Hyun didn't understand was why everyone was laughing, because his father had definitely exploited them, and it would have been more logical for them to treat him with hostility, but everyone around him was so kind. It seemed as if the people had been brainwashed, so the young man assumed that his father had given them gold or something else. Wang Chong ran up to the young master, scattering all the workers with his shouts. Suddenly, the man stopped abruptly and looked lovingly at the strong maid, Jung Hye. He obviously liked her and wanted to appear serious in front of her. He stood up straight, and his sudden change in behavior puzzled the young man. Chong began to say that the work would be ready in half a day. Seizing the opportunity, Hyun asked what his father did, and the man smiled and even laughed a little, asking why the boy was so eager to brag about him. The man put on a mini performance, proudly saying that his master, the patriarch, was a great scholar whom other scholars looked up to, a symbol of honesty. The young man remembered how his father would circle around him and call him a little peanut, and he couldn't believe that they were talking about that very man. But that was just one of Yu Sun's many virtues, because when famine struck, he opened his warehouse to share food and clothing with others. So he was respected by the entire Anpin prefecture. The young man did not listen to what they said about his father because he was thinking about how the man turned out to be much more interesting than he had thought. Putting it all together, he realized that he was the only son of a rich man who was respected by the whole village, so he didn't have to do anything to live a happy life. Realizing this, he interrupted the man's laudatory ode, which was at the point where he was saying that he would never be able to repay the patriarch for the good he had done for him. Everyone present looked at him in surprise, not understanding why he suddenly said this, and he burst into sincere laughter. In the end, Hyun began his training and swam daily in his own pool. As he surfaced again, he asked Hwang Jong if he had brought what the boy had asked for. Barely lifting his arms, the man showed him a stone block with a chain attached to it. The young man climbed out of the water and the heavy weight was placed on his leg. He thought that if it weren't for the chaos, he could live peacefully and fool around. But somewhere nearby was his accomplice who could destroy everything, so Hyun had to train. Hwang Chong threw the stone into the water with all his might, pulling the young man down with it. The young man descended to the bottom for training. The human circulatory system is completely open at birth, but closes over time, which is why energy training must begin as early as possible. The boy began his practice in a standing position because his body was not able to sit in the lotus position. With a body that had never been trained, it would take 100 or even 1,000 years to achieve the necessary internal energy. However, his far-sighted master had prepared a method of training internal energy even for such a difficult case. This technique was called cultivating the heart of spiritual energy. The young man was surrounded by 4 breaths that filled him with energy. Hyun allowed the energy to flow to his heart instead of his energy core and into his blood vessels, instead of his energy veins. In the end, the young man smiled contentedly because his plan had worked, and now the spirit energy that would replace his internal energy began to fill his heart. Now, focusing, he felt the flow of water. The young man spun around, feeling the water, and was able to try some techniques. He decided to try Shaolin's strongest fist technique, which could break a boulder at a distance of more than 100 feet and was called the 100-foot mystical fist. Hyun tried other techniques while reciting spells. The 8 eternal ones descend, walking as if drunk, the sect of beggars, the 8 drunken eternal steps, the sword with endless variations of the Namgung clan. Hwang Chong, who was waiting for his master on the mountain, was already yawning from boredom. He did not expect the young master to hold up so well underwater, and assumed that this gift had opened up in him after he nearly drowned. In fact, the man thought that his master would give up in 3 days, but he had been doing this for at least a month. At first, he thought Hyun had gone mad when he asked him to attach a stone ball to his leg. Finally, it was time for the next weighing. The young man stood and stared at the scales as if they were his mortal enemy while Hwang Chong loaded pigs onto the pan. For a whole month, he trained like a madman with a body that even the legendary Hua Tuo could not change. The young man took a bold step onto the scales. He felt nervous tension because if he couldn't get rid of the fat, all his hopes would be dashed. The man held his breath and watched the scales needle move back and forth, unable to settle down, creating unnecessary excitement. And then it finally happened. The needle stopped right in the center, and the straps didn't break under the weight. The young man even shed a tear when he realized that he had lost weight. Hwang Chong rushed to hug his young master, and the young man, overcome with joy, hugged the man, squeezing the last bit of air out of him and saying that it was because he was there. When Hyun realized that he was hurting him, he stepped back and apologized, but the man understood everything. He himself was incredibly happy for his master. To the sound of pigs oinking, they discussed how much easier it would be now that they wouldn't have to mend torn clothes every day. Picking up the piglets, the man said that the chair carriers would also not have to worry so much about their backs. In general, everything would become easier. Hwang Chong blabbed a little and secretly said that there were rumors that the young man had been adopted because he was fat, but now they should stop. Here, the young man gently hinted that he had already learned too much, and it was time to end the conversation. But the man lost his tact and started talking about rumors that Hyun's fiancée had rejected him because he was fat. The atmosphere suddenly became angry, and the young man insisted once again that it was time to stop. Then it dawned on him and the man ran away, saying that the patriarch had asked him to do something and that he would return as soon as he had completed the task. The young man sat down to rest. Now he had spiritual energy and was losing weight, but his body was still far from what he was used to. Internal energy was what people got from numerous trainings, but cultivating the spirit energy of the mind was more like consuming creatures or herbs that contained spirit energy. It was a kind of quick way to become stronger. However, without consuming mystical creatures, a person could not reach a certain level even if they trained their entire life. So the young man had to get the mystical herb that the bastard's accomplice, the young ginseng, had found. The young man remembered that he was to be found on Haoshan in a few months, approximately 6, and that was not enough time. He dreamed of having a little spiritual energy in his snacks And just at that moment, he was handed a bowl of food. A doctor stood nearby and smiled, saying that the young man's body must be shocked from the amount of training he had undergone recently, so he offered him a drink. The young man didn't even listen to what the man was saying, but snatched the bowl from his hands, thanked him, and drank it all in one gulp. The man added a 15-year-old root of something to it, but it was no longer audible over the sounds of Hyun devouring the food. After a while, the doctor waited a little and politely asked him to return the bowl. After that, the young man went to meditate because he wanted to absorb the energy of the spirit from the broth until it was digested. The energy obtained from the portion of the potion was very weak, but was gaining strength. Hyun smiled at the anticipation of soon seeing his ally of chaos filled with strength. The boy continued to regularly drink the potion prepared for him by the herbalist and to train by simply walking. For convenience, he even tied up his long, silky hair so that it would not interfere with his walking. Hwang Chong, who was always nearby, supported his master morally as best he could. At this pace, with little effort, another month passed. Hyun was training underwater again. The young man practiced the palm technique tirelessly, and the water in the pool began to rise in a violent wave. Hwang Chong, who was watching the waves rise from the shore, assumed that the young man could use this technique. Then he shook his head because he couldn't imagine that his master, a proud pig, knew such a technique. Suddenly, someone approached him from behind and asked who he was talking about. The man, who had a loose tongue, blurted out that he was, of course, talking about his young master. But when he turned around, he realized that it was a fatal mistake because Mr. Yu Song was standing behind him. He sternly asked the man who he was talking about, calling him a proud pig. Calling Hwang Chong's full title, who was the exclusive escort of the Yu clan and a former inspector, the man grabbed his sword, radiating an aura of anger. At that moment, a young man with green hair who had arrived with Yu Song intervened and ordered the guards to drag Hwang Chong away. He smiled at the man because he felt a little sorry for him and sent him to the warehouse under the pretext of rest because he had been working for a long time. The man cried with emotion at the chief administrator's kindness and sincerely thanked him for saving him. The patriarch immediately became distracted and said that the administrator should have seen it too. At first, the young man did not understand what was being discussed, but when he saw the enthusiastic expression on the face of the man with whom he usually talked about his son, he realized that they were talking about the strike that Hyun had used. Although the administrator did not believe that it was the same technique. Although Yusu was a little disappointed that his son did not want to study the exact sciences, as a father, he was willing to do anything if his son wanted to study martial arts. The administrator was a little tense about the man's words and began to wonder what the old man was up to again. He didn't have to think long, because the gentleman ordered paper and ink to be brought to him immediately. He was going to write a letter to the imperial court. After a while, the father called his son to him and handed him a book that was a guide to the divine paradise. The young man looked at it, could not understand anything, and asked his father for an explanation again. The man, beaming with happiness, happily announced that it was a secret guide to martial arts given to them by the imperial court. Hyun looked at his father with new eyes, thinking that he was just a little bit outstanding in his studies, but the secret guide to martial arts from the emperor said that he was respected at court. His father said that it was an unexpected generosity and that he did not expect to receive the best manual because he only mentioned that his son was interested in martial arts, and the administrator replied that this was a lie and that the man wrote letters to the emperor every day. In his letters, Yu Song played on pity and said that the emperor no longer had such affection for him and had completely forgotten about his loyal scholar, immersed in his worries. But that's not all. In addition, his father found a martial arts master for his son to teach him. His new master was the administrator who always followed the patriarch and was also the boy's brother-in-law. The young man's name was Dam Jung-woo, and he was the husband of the boy's sister, Yu Jung-hae. The Dam clan, from which the young man came, was the best martial arts clan in Hubei province. He was very proud when Yu Song told him about his distinguished family. Yeon sighed heavily, wondering what he should do. He knew that the patriarch of the Dam clan would bow down to learn his skills, so it was unlikely that he would be taught anything. He considered telling him the truth about his rebirth, that he was Jin Wigan, but remembering how the man had raged at the doctor who had failed to resurrect him, he changed his mind. Yu Song and Jong-woo bumped fists when they saw the satisfied look in the boy's eyes, not knowing that he was happy because he was planning to accumulate internal energy during this time. This was a chance for him to blame all his inexplicable power on Dam Jung-woo's teachings, and if they suddenly decided to ask him what martial art he was using, he would say that it was from the teachings of the divine paradise. The boy suddenly fell to his knees and told his brother-in-law that he was now his disciple and asked him to accept this bow. Seeing this, his father bit his lip and cried. His son, among other things, was so polite that it warmed his father's heart. Jung-woo laughed awkwardly and asked his brother-in-law to get up, but he couldn't because he was seized by a cramp from the sudden movement. The grueling training began. The master yelled a lot at his student, demanding that he stand in the correct basic position. Each time he sighed heavily, not understanding why the young man couldn't perform such simple movements. The man demanded that the boy repeat the movement over and over again, thinking that he was being too easy on him, even though Hyun was sweating profusely. As soon as the young man tried to ask something, addressing the man by his family status, the man immediately shouted that he was not his brother-in-law, but his master. Then the young man corrected himself because he didn't care what to call the man and asked to move on to the next exercises, saying that it was important for him to know other elements in order to perform the technique. Jungwoo called the young man a fool, saying that they couldn't do anything without a foundation. He said outright that he didn't know how the young man could learn anything if he was so stupid. This annoyed the young man, who thought his brother-in-law considered himself very smart just because he played along with him. He decided that 10 days without stress was enough and that he could now show all his talents. Jungwoo started talking about how the naive young man, who lived an easy life, mistakenly assumed that the six-fist technique was some kind of joke. But even in the simplest movements, one could find the law of the universe. Suddenly, Hyun proposed a fight if the man did not believe his words. He wanted to spar using a combination of the six-fist technique for combat. The young man suggested proving who was right, the one who was fixated on the fundamentals or the one who understood the basic principle. Jungwoo began to chuckle and then laughed loudly, scaring all the crows around him. He found the young man's proposal to measure their strength amusing. The young man decided to take the man's challenge and, picking his nose, asked if he was afraid. And he hit the nail on the head. Jungwoo flushed. Clenching his fists, he said that although he was now part of the Yu clan, he had previously belonged to the Seven Dragons clan of Hubei. Hyun continued to tease him, saying that if the man couldn't handle it, he could just leave. The manipulation worked perfectly. His brother-in-law agreed to the fight, but said that he couldn't just fight the boy because of his superior strength and sealed his inner energy for a fair fight. In addition, he tied his hand with a purple ribbon and allowed the young man to attack first. Hyun smiled and asked him not to take his words back later. The young man decided to start with the dragon bird's flight and accelerated, enveloped in the blue energy of the spirit. Jungwoo just stood there, waiting for a weak blow, but at the last moment he opened his eyes and managed to dodge the impressive attack that he definitely did not expect to see. He was impressed by how smoothly the young man combined the movements of 6 combinations of fist techniques. The young man had to admit that his opponent lived up to his name if he was able to dodge. Although Hyun had gained the energy of the spirits, his frail, stocky body still hindered him too much. But he couldn't pay too much attention to this because he had to finish everything quickly while he was still on his feet. Delivering the final blow, the young man said that the stronger one should behave like a big shot. The young man knocked his teacher to the ground, and the latter stammered that this was quite unexpected. When Hyun swung again, Jungwoo called the boy his brother-in-law, and the young man reminded him that he was not his brother-in-law, but his student. Meanwhile, Hwang Chong stood at the gate at the entrance and was already falling asleep on guard duty from exhaustion. His young partner wanted to let the man go so he could rest a little, but he refused because he could not disobey the patriarch's order. The young man said bluntly that the man had been half asleep all day, so the quality of his performance was mediocre. Suddenly, someone who knew about his demotion approached him and said that from the outside it looked like a gift. It was the young master who approached him. He said that it was somehow too easy, considering that it was supposed to be a punishment, and Hwang Chong still managed to sleep during work. The man was surprised to see Hyun because he thought he should be in training. The young man proudly declared that his brother-in-law was not in a position to train him. He was pleased with his actions and wondered if his master had woken up yet. The man had indeed regained consciousness and was lying in a hospital bed moaning because his whole body ached. His wife sat by his bed and skeptically asked if he was really trying to convince her that her frail fat brother had brought him to this state. Jungwoo didn't want anything else. He just asked his wife to help him scratch his itchy head because he couldn't do it himself due to the bandages. But suddenly, the girl began to jump for joy, saying that this was exactly what she expected from Hyun. She said that she knew her brother would be a martial arts master, ignoring her husband who tearfully begged her for help because he was in pain. Jonghae politely left, leaving the man alone, saying that he would feel better after resting. Junwoo was already tired of this crazy family who fussed over the fat young man as if he were a national treasure. Meanwhile, the patriarch of one of the provincial families arrived in the city. His servant took care of his master and, no matter how much he thought about it, came to the only conclusion that it was better for his master not to get involved in the matter. He had to deal with the matter personally because Mr. Yu had politely asked him to, so he ordered his assistant Choksun to go with him to the remote beggar sects of Anpi Prefecture. Over time, Hyun lost a little more weight and walked alone for the first time in his body. He wanted to see the world that had existed beautifully until chaos came. He went out onto the street, which was crowded with people who were rejoicing and talking to each other. The young man watched from the sidelines as people talked and shared their amazing stories, living peaceful and happy lives. And little children ran around playing, getting under the feet of adults, enjoying a happy childhood without worries. The boy smiled because everything was better than he had thought, because in his past life he had never seen people smile. When the minion of chaos appeared and took over the world, shadows engulfed the peace and laughter, and people had no place to rest, and joy was impossible where corpses were used as tents from the rain. Yun remembered a poem about how the cold wets your sleeves and freezes when winter comes, so he hoped that they would send him far away at the beginning, and now he was finally here, where he could save everything. As soon as passers-by saw the young master, they immediately surrounded him and began asking various questions, wondering why he was walking instead of riding in a carriage as usual. A girl shouted for everyone to come out and see the miracle of how the young master Yu-hyo was walking. The young man felt a little strange because of this excessive attention to his ordinary actions. He felt like an animal in a zoo. A lady kindly offered the boy a bunch of sweet persimmons. Yun looked at the tempting treats and thought he couldn't take them because he was on a diet. Another elderly lady offered the young man to try on some new silk she had recently received. In general, everyone began to bring a bunch of goodies to the young master, a vase made by a famous master and other packages. Weapons, livestock, and a bunch of other trinkets quickly found their way into the young man's hands. He could no longer take anything and begged them not to push all sorts of things on him. Hyun shouted that he didn't need anything because he had only gone out for a walk and wasn't going to carry anything. But then he suddenly noticed the happy faces of the people who were bringing him gifts and smiled. The voice of his task began to reach the young man from within, bringing him to his senses, because in reality, at such moments, he wanted to live his whole life so peacefully and happily. The young man became a little irritated like a child, because if these offerings continued, he would not be able to walk normally. Suddenly, Hyun felt something strange, even though there was only a cheerful crowd with gifts around him. But in fact, someone was watching him from the corner. The man felt that he had been noticed. But he immediately dismissed these thoughts because recently the guy couldn't even walk, and sensing someone else's energy was completely beyond his level. While the stranger was lost in his thoughts, the young man quietly approached him, put his hand on his shoulder, and decided to ask what was going on. But the man, frightened, decided to attack the young man. Fortunately, the young man managed to defend himself, but he felt that his opponent was dangerous. The attack caused a commotion and raised an alarm, and concerned people rushed to the corner to check if the young master was all right. There they found the young man lying unconscious and immediately called a doctor for help. The stranger began to quickly flee the scene, and the people realized that he was the reason for the young man's loss of consciousness and immediately shouted for him to be caught. Suddenly, Hyun came to his senses and in a fit of rage began shouting, asking where the man had gone. He threatened to destroy him. The people standing around were deeply shocked and concerned by the events and the young man's anger. The young man quickly realized that they were worried about him, got up, straightened himself, and said that he was fine, even though he was actually in pain. Wiping his face, he looked in the direction the man had run and tried to understand who he was. From the attack of this unknown man, it was clear that he was a fairly strong martial artist, but what was unclear was why such a talent had been forgotten in the peaceful Anping Prefecture. After all, Anping Prefecture was only part of Murama that the boy had to save. Hyun strode resolutely home because he needed to improve his martial arts skills quickly. Passers-by watched him with surprised and admiring glances, thinking that the young man was quite strong and that now Mr. Yu would be calm about him. The young man had almost completed his basic training in spirit energy circulation. Now he needed to lose weight and gather the necessary information. The boy assumed that if he wanted to get information about young Ginseng, he would have to visit the beggar's lair. Meanwhile, at the Yu estate, the patriarch of the family sat and talked with his daughter. She said that academic sciences and martial arts were interrelated. The man was pleased, assuming that his son had inherited his intelligence and could become an outstanding general. He wondered whether he should start preparing the young man to enter government service. Yu Song couldn't decide what to do first. The girl, who was a little calmer, advised her father not to rush into anything because it was too early to decide. The man justified himself by saying that it was natural for him, as a father, to want to help his son, who had a talent for martial arts. Jong Hae tried to explain that there was no need to rush, as the boy had only recently started walking. Suddenly, she made her husband feel uncomfortable by asking if he was behaving this way because of the Namgung clan. The girl sighed heavily and said that, of course, the reason for the clan's refusal to marry could be because of Hyun. However, it could have been Namgung Hae's own decision, as she had no desire to get married since childhood. She wanted to live her life as a martial arts master, not as a person tied to another person. Looking at her father's gloomy expression, Jong-hae realized that this was not about the Namgun clan. Yu Seong said that if he didn't do this, he would never be free of his guilt towards Hyun. Despite his daughter's assurances that her mother's death was not his fault, the man still believed that he was to blame because they were hunting him, and he was the one who should have died. At the entrance to the city, sitting in a carriage, two men discussed that the Yu family should propose marriage again. They had heard rumors that Yu Hyun was lazy and spent all his time in bed because he was overweight, and they said that he even had a bad temper, so they would have refused him anyway, but that was precisely why the men had come there. When the carriage was almost there, the men peered through the open door. Yu Hyun was their enemy, so they acted on the principle of knowing your enemy and knowing yourself so that you never lose the battle. One of the men was the patriarch of the Namgun clan, Hansu. He wanted to learn more about the boy in order to reject him once and for all. At that moment, Yu Hyun sneezed loudly, which was a sign that someone was going to stab him in the back. The young man had just arrived at the neighborhood where he was supposed to meet the beggars. He looked around, scaring a cat, but did not find any beggars, even though there should have been plenty of them in such a poor neighborhood. The young man had no idea where everyone had gone, when suddenly a poorly dressed man approached him and asked what he was looking for. Hyun said he was just walking around, but asked bluntly why there were no beggars in the backyards. The man thought he was joking, because it had been 20 years since beggars had ceased to exist in Anping Prefecture. And it was all thanks to Hyun's father, because the patriarch had built a home for vagrants and even rented out a farm. Now the young man understood why everyone wanted to give him something so much. The boy remembered his teacher's words that birds would listen to what he said during the day and mice would listen to what he said at night. But simple animals could not understand human words. The only creatures whose ears and eyes are brighter than those of animals, and who are everywhere and nowhere at the same time, are beggars. Living in the shadows and under the walls, they created a special information network, a sect of beggars. Hyun grabbed his head, realizing that if there were no beggars here, then there was no branch of their sect, and he had hoped that they would be everywhere. The man heard the boy's anxious cries and realized that he was looking for the beggars sect, and it seemed that he knew something about it. Meanwhile, the patriarch of the Namgung clan sat and drank tea with a stranger. The man understood that such a distinguished person would not have come all this way just to drink tea with a beggar. He understood perfectly well that they had come to him to find out about Yu Hyun, who had recently discussed marriage with the Namgun family. The man's name was Oh Hyun, and he was the head of the Anpin Prefecture branch of the Beggars sect. The beggar understood perfectly well that they had come to him for information that would help them refuse Yu Hyun's marriage proposal. This was exactly what Hansu expected from the Beggars sect. Suddenly, Oh Hyun apologized and said that he could not provide information about Yu Hyun. It was special, and he first had to get permission from the main branch. The patriarch frowned, understanding perfectly well that they were trying to bargain with him. But the beggar waved it off, saying that the top brass had simply assigned heavenly status to the information about Yu Hyun. Instead of the man, a young man standing nearby spoke up, insisting that information about the son of an ordinary scientist who was not even a member of the sect was not worth the attention of the main branch, and the patriarch stopped him by raising his hand. Oh Hyun said that this made sense because if the old fool, the patriarch of the Yu clan, decided to rage, not only the Anping branch, but also the main branch would be in great danger. Hansu threw a bag of precious stones on the table and said he would pay any price. The beggar laughed and cautiously remarked that it seemed as if the man had not heard his words about the threat. He continued to insist that he needed permission from the main branch. Then the patriarch of the Namgung clan raised the stakes and took off his jade ring and placed it on the table with a serious expression on his face. It was an imperial ring, and its mere presence meant that the person was under the protection of the Namgun clan. The son standing next to his father shouted at him, asking how he dared to use such a precious thing. At that moment, Yu Hyun arrived at the building for beggars. Looking at its beautiful appearance, he understood why he couldn't find it. It had nothing in common with the neighborhoods where homeless people usually lived. The young man was about to calmly enter when suddenly a guard at the entrance stopped him, calling him fat and pointing a sword at him, and told him to come back later because they had important guests at the moment. The young man was angry that they spoke to him so rudely and called him names, even though they were seeing him for the first time in their lives. But despite his inner rage, he decided to restrain himself. Now, he was not the good-natured Jin Wigan, but the only young master of the Yu family, so Hyun politely asked the guard to put away his weapon while he was still being polite. But the guard did not listen to him and swung his arm, saying that the young man should clean his ears and get out of there. He crossed the line by calling the boy a pig, and advised him to leave before he humiliated him. But the young man said that he had already been humiliated and added that soon the guard would be spitting blood. When he turned to face him, the young man smiled, grinning like a wild beast that had found its prey. At that moment, his father arrived at the old tiger's house, where he was politely greeted by the guards at the entrance. The beggar, who had been offered a precious item, sat on a chair in a daze, unable to understand why anyone would risk such valuable things. He did not believe that the only reason was such a strong hatred of marriage to Yoo Hyun. Hansu offered not only the ring, but also to discuss additional compensation after receiving the information. Such an offer greatly tempted the beggar, and after taking another sip of tea, he decided to share the information. Oh Hyun handed over a notebook containing all the information about Yoo Hyun from the beginning of his life, including yesterday's events. Before letting him go, the man held the notebook tightly and emphasized that no one should know who gave them this information. Finally, Hanasu snatched the unfortunate notebook from his hands and swore by the Namgun clan that he would keep everything a secret. The beggar left the man alone to enjoy his reading and went to write a letter to send to the head office. As soon as the man opened the first page, his son heard a noise on the street and decided to go check what was happening. The young man approached the window and saw an unexpected scene. A fat man was fighting with a security guard. The guard was hit in the face and realized that he had let his guard down a little, not expecting the fat man to be so agile. He praised him, saying that the young man was quite skilled because he was able to dodge the sword of the endless sky, even though he had not yet used his inner energy. Hyun laughed at the fact that the blade in the guard's hands was called the Endless Sky Sword. This hurt his opponent's feelings because it showed contempt for his clan's martial arts. The young man said that he looked down on the guy, not on the technique of the Endless Sky Sword, which was an incredible sword technique, but the guard was not very good at it. Even if he swung his sword forever, it would still be meaningless, so Hyun suggested that he give up. He realized that he was facing a bastard from the Namgung clan and said that it was not too late to apologize, and then he would forgive him. The guard took offense at the insult to his clan and lunged at the boy with his sword for daring to speak such words about his clan with his fat tongue. He stopped his sword a millimeter from the young man's neck and said that from now on, there would be no warnings. Hyun engraved the fact that the representative of the Namgun clan was the first to draw his sword and quickly disappeared from the field of attack, striking the boy in the solar plexus. The blow knocked the sword out of the guard's hands, and the young master grabbed him by the hair and said that he should have stepped aside when he first said so. Then he slapped him hard across his insolent face. After knocking the scoundrel to the ground, the young man continued to strike him. Eventually, a crowd gathered around him. Swinging his arm again, Hyun said that if the Namgung clan had not taught the guard good manners, then he would take on that role himself. As he slapped him, he said that the guy should be grateful for his training, so to speak, his educational beating. Suddenly, someone intervened in their fight, appearing with a loud jump. Hyun had to jump back, because the angry son of the Namgung clan patriarch was flying at him. This evoked some familiar feelings in him. But there was no time to think about it because first, he had to deal with the explosive lightning technique of the mystical fist. His current body couldn't take such a blow, but he knew how the strike mechanism worked. It was a martial art that used the rotation of lightning to enhance the power of a fist strike. The young man grabbed his fist with both palms and decided to rotate it in the other direction, reducing the momentum. At that moment of the great collision of blue and yellow energy, Hans peered out of the window of the house, wondering what the commotion was outside. And at that moment, he saw the scene of the fight. His son just felt the force of his punch decrease. Looking at the tense face of the young man, Hyun recognized him as someone he knew in a past life. It was the face of one of his teachers. He remembered his training when the master sat under a tree in the cool shade and counted the number of sword swings. He looked wearily at the young man standing on a plank in the river and waving his sword, the number of swings approaching 30,000. In the end, he made 30,000 and fell because his body was already too strained. But the teacher thought otherwise and said that the boy had fallen because his sword swings were not balanced enough, so he ordered him to do another 10,000. He trained him in sword fighting day and night, and no matter how hard Vegan tried, he could not defeat the master. After another failure, he rubbed his head, complaining that no one in their right mind would use a sword as a club. He realized he had said too much when he caught the master's terrifying gaze. But then the man smiled and said that seeing the anger the young man felt, he had to understand the true essence of the Sword of Seven Essences. For the master, there was no greater joy than seeing his student grow. But Vegan was not comforted by these words because he already knew what they meant. The man swung his fist, saying that he would help him grow even more. Now was the time to make his master his student, but because of this moment of thoughtfulness, the young man lost his advantage and the blow reached its target. Hyun's consciousness had clouded, and he could only vaguely see silhouettes and fragments of conversations around him. Meanwhile, the son of the Namgun patriarch, despite managing to push the boy away, could not understand how he had managed to dispel the force of his blow. He clearly felt that it had happened, but he did not know how it was possible. Hyun, meanwhile, came to his senses, jumped to his feet, and remembering his master's mockery, decided that it was time to destroy his young counterpart. There was a palpable tension between the two, but suddenly, people began to gather in front of Hyun, blocking his view. The young man from the Namgun clan had no idea what was going on or why they were doing this. Suddenly, the situation changed with a crash. It was the young master who had collapsed unconscious, and everyone around began to call for a doctor. Meanwhile, the beggar finished writing the letter and cheerfully went out into the street to the head of the Namgun clan. The man froze in shock when he saw Yu Hyun lying unconscious on the ground, surrounded by people, with an expression on his face that seemed ready to destroy everything around him. As soon as the beggar said the boy's name, the man and his son looked at him with concern. The doctor quickly rushed to the young man and, examining him, muttered, asking what kind of evil scoundrel could have done such a thing to the young master. Everyone around turned their angry gaze to the poor culprit, Han's son. The young man looked nervously at his father, sweating profusely because he was worried that he had completely messed up. But his father just laughed and tore up the notebook because he no longer needed the information about the boy. After this, marriage was definitely out of the question. Yu Shang quickly found out about the incident and appeared at the shelter, shouting that he knew this would happen because of the beggar's sect. The Namgun family stood guiltily before the patriarch of the Yu clan, while Oh Hyun lay at the man's feet, assuring him that his sect had nothing to do with it, that it was all the doing of the young man he was pointing at. Hansu began to justify his son, saying that he had done so only because he did not know that Hyun was in front of him, but Yu's son was not appeased by this. He did not consider it normal to swing a sword in front of innocent people. The man raged, insisting that if the boy had not been Yu Hyun's future son-in-law, he would have lost his head for his actions. The beggar used a special sound technique to warn Hansu to immediately fall to his knees. Despite his nervousness, the man was not sure if he should do it, but Oh Hyun said that Mr. Yu might call the palace guards because of this incident. The beggar said outright that the man was a real fool because he was standing in front of a former imperial commander who was respected even by the current emperor. Junwoo held his father-in-law back so that he wouldn't do anything stupid, and the man did not intend to rush at people, but simply said that he was going to the emperor. Then Hansu realized the seriousness of the situation, fell to his knees, and began to beg for forgiveness and promise that it would not happen again. Now 2 men were loudly begging for mercy, which was quite annoying to the lord. Yu Xiong shouted angrily, asking if they didn't understand that his only son, the apple of his eye, was on the verge of death. Suddenly, the door opened and Yu Hyun came out of the room, safe and sound, asking what was going on. The man beamed with happiness when he saw his son, but his son-in-law couldn't understand what had happened to the boy's hair, as it was tied back in 2 buns. The girls passing by blushed and began to whisper to each other. To them, Hyun looked very cute with his hair tied up. They advised him not to untie it anymore. Yu Sung calmed down a little and asked his son in a more balanced tone if he was okay. As soon as the beggar looked up and saw the boy, he immediately rushed to him, examining him from all sides and asking with concern if he was all right and if he had any internal injuries. Then, he began to praise his amazing agility because he was able to soften Namgun's blow and insisted that he should have been called earlier. Hyun just looked at the man in confusion, ignoring everything he said, and walked past him. He approached Hansu, bowed to him, and apologized for being late with his greetings and calling him his older brother. The man scratched the back of his head, slightly confused. In his complicated family tree, they were cousins. The young man heard only a fragment of what was being said on the street and asked why his father wanted to go to the palace. Yu Song pointed to the representatives of the Namgun clan and said that he was going to inform the emperor about the behavior of these obscurantists. Shaking his head, the young man politely remarked that the emperor was a very important and busy person and that he should not be bothered with such matters. The man's expression changed instantly, and he said that perhaps he had indeed gone too far. But he glanced at Hansu's son with the gaze of a fierce bear and said that he would not forgive the one who had struck Hyun. The young man sighed heavily, approached his offender, and asked if he was Sun. The young man did not quite understand what was happening. Meanwhile, Hyun said how nice it was to meet him and introduced himself, saying that even though Sun was older than him, Hyun was still his uncle. Inside, he was gloating because he had been eagerly awaiting this day when he would meet his cruel master in his young form. He grabbed him by the cheek and began to tug at him like a small child, emphasizing that he was his uncle. He was happy to have met the Sword King Namgung's son in this life. One day, he would become one of the 6 Orthodox saints and the teacher of the psychic vegan. In his memories, he was skilled at using a sword as a club to beat the crap out of others. He remembered well how they beat him while he begged his crazy master to stop. For a moment, he would stop, smile, and call the boy by name, and then swing again and scold the boy for dropping the sword from his hands, saying that he was still a martial arts master. He kept asking if his student would do the same in a real fight, throw down his weapon, and beg the enemy for mercy. He forever remembered the sadistic smile with which the man beat him, saying that he still had so much to teach his student. The boy was torn from his sweet memories by a dream in which he asked his uncle to take his hands off him. The young man froze for a second, remembering how he had done this during the attack. He could forget about his teacher, but his body could not, so he missed the blow because of his memories. Hyun even cried from such memories because in his thoughts he imagined how he would remember everything to his master and return his attitude 100-fold. The whole so-called family and the beggar gathered at one table. An awkward silence hung in the air until Hyun asked what had brought his older brother here. Hwan got nervous. He didn't know what to say because if he told the truth, Mr. Yu might get angry again. But the young man seemed to save the situation by asking if they had come to talk about the wedding. But his next sentence shocked them even more when he said that he could not accept the Namgung family's proposal. In response to his father's surprised question, despite the fact that a part of him was screaming that he didn't want to get married because he had to destroy his accomplice, he politely asked his father to respect his wishes. Then he turned to his cousin and, assuming that he must also be disappointed, said that unfortunately there was nothing that could be done. A marriage of convenience concluded without the consent of the parties involved was not right. Even if he was stuck in this body in Anping Prefecture, he could not wait forever like a frog in a well. He had to help the emperor take care of the next generation, which was the future of their state. The young man was going to not only watch over him, but also interact with him, improving himself and learning how the world works. He declared that as long as he continued to move forward in his knowledge, he would decide to join Murimu. Surprised, Yu Song stood up and said that it was nonsense for the young man to join Murim. He believed that this place was full of beggars, hooligans, and bandits, pointing to the Namgung family, and did not understand why the young man was eager to go there. The relatives were a little offended to hear such comparisons about themselves. Here, Hyun resorted to manipulation, asking if his father considered his brother Chang Soon, who was also a member of Murim, to be such a person. Martial arts masters had their reasons for living there, and besides, they were studying there. When he turned to his older brother and said that he was sure that Mrs. Namgung felt the same way. The young man had already played all his cards for Hans, and all that was left for him to do was to agree. In fact, he should have been grateful to Hyun for playing along and freeing him from his marriage obligations. The young man tried to be polite, coughed to get the man's attention, and asked his older brother to listen to his foolish brother's request. The man came to his senses and tried to come up with a coherent answer on the fly, but it didn't work. But that was enough. Hyun said he would take it as a sign that everyone had agreed to his request and calmly left the room. Just before leaving, the young man turned back and smiled, asking the branch manager, "Oh Hyun," to come with him. The man jumped up like a bullet to serve his master. The young man put his arm around his shoulder like an old friend and leaned over and said that they needed to go out and talk alone. They left the room, leaving the uncle and nephew alone in an awkward silence. When Hyun came out, Oh Hyun began to praise his impeccable hairstyle. The thing is, while he was being resuscitated, something happened. Despite the compliments pouring in about his hair, the young man still let it down because there was already too much sweet attention. The beggar tried to praise something, but the young man clearly brought the conversation back to the point. The man was surprised by the young man's enthusiasm for Murimu and his interest in the masters. Hyun emphasized that it was normal for a beginner to be interested in such things. The young man thought of his teachers and rejoiced at the prospect of meeting them and mocking them as they had mocked him, calling it training. When the young man emerged from his fantasies, he asked the beggar if Murim was divided into demonic orthodox and unorthodox clans. The man said that there was no significant division, but in general they were all engaged in survival. The boy knew that this was temporary because very soon many would unite around the servant of chaos. This information confirmed the young man's assumption that he had no time to fool around, so he had to quickly fill himself with the energy of the spirits. Only then could he defeat his enemy, but something comforted the young man. Now he could take his first student. The next day, Hyun persistently went to train at the reservoir. Hwang Chong suggested that he stop and rest because after yesterday's loss of consciousness, he needed to regain his strength. The young man turned around and asked directly if the man was worried about him or about being expelled from the guard. The man began to mutter something under his breath and nervously talk about how the boy could be so heartless. Suddenly, the young man's sister appeared and said in a scolding tone that Hyun should take better care of himself and rest. As soon as the man saw the maid Jung Hye, he immediately blushed, straightened his back, and tried to look proud. The girl asked him why Hwang Chong didn't stop the guy. The man began to make excuses again. The young lady's voice became more confused when she asked her brother if he remembered how dangerous it was in Murim. The boy knew that his mother had died because of the strife in Murim. They try not to mention it so as not to stir up the past, but even if they remain silent, the wounds will not heal, so simply remaining silent is not an option. The young man decided to speak directly and began by asking his sister why she was so scared, whether he looked weak and unreliable. The girl did not expect such a frank speech and questions from her brother. With a smile, the young man promised that nothing bad would happen to the Yu clan anymore. He would not allow it. Zhang He smiled, realizing that her little brother was no longer a child. He had grown up. She came closer, took him by the cheek, and said that it was time for her to realize that the boy had grown up. The young man was a little confused and did not understand why his sister was behaving this way. Everything was so awkward. His family had been destroyed when he was still a child, but now the body he found himself in had its own family with warm relationships. The young man continued his diligent training and steadily lost weight. He was already in almost perfect shape. Huang Chong watched all his training sessions and ran after him, worried that the young master might fall accidentally. Yun lost all the extra weight and looked great in his clothes, but underneath they hid kilograms of excess skin. At dinner, the boy shared his plans to go to Anhui, but his father was against it because his son was too thin, so he was worried that he might fall and break something. Yun referred to Oh Hyun's words about the wonderful sight of snowfall in Hyunsun. His father was furious that beggars were encouraging his son to do all sorts of foolish things. The boy accidentally said that he planned to stay with the Namgun family. Yu Sung asked why he suddenly wanted to do that. Of course, the young man was going to teach his cousin. But Hyun couldn't say that directly, so he started a story about how they were relatives after all, and needed to show respect because last time their communication didn't go very well. His father was against it, saying that they had caused trouble in their town last time, but his son confidently put his cup on the table and said that everything had already been decided. He said he was leaving and assured his father that he would return safe and sound so that his father would not worry. Hyun left the room without listening to Yusun's objections, saying that he believed his father had agreed to the trip. The man understood that his son had made up his mind and that he couldn't stop him, so he was confused and didn't know what to do. The boy went to his room to pack his bags. He was happy and thought about safety measures because no one was supposed to recognize him on his trip. The young man made himself a mask out of bandages and decided that now he would be able to travel freely under his usual name, Jin Wigan. But when he opened the door to his room, he saw a bunch of soldiers and stretchers, which did not contribute to his anonymous journey. Wang Chong was already happy to welcome the young master. Surprised, Hyun asked, pointing to the people, what was going on. The answer was simple. It was just a delegation that was to accompany the young man to Anhui. The young man did not understand why anyone else needed to go. The man was surprised because he realized that the boy had not been warned that the patriarch was also going. An image of his overly caring father, proud of his son, flashed before Hyun's eyes. The young man waved his hands to dispel this delusion. The annoying tale in the form of the patriarch of the Yu clan ruined all the plans of the young man who wanted to find the chaste ginseng and destroy the servant of chaos. The problem was that no one could find out about his real plans. If he told the truth, his father would raise such a fuss that his plan would surely come to an end. Hyun clearly understood that he must not be exposed, and to do this, he first had to get rid of the annoying leech in the form of Huang Chong's servant. Suddenly, the young man remembered a certain potion, and a sly smile appeared under his bandages, signaling the emergence of some cunning plan. Citing the late hour, the young man suggested resting before departure. The man was surprised that his master wanted to postpone the trip until tomorrow. Ayon said that they had nowhere to rush to and further puzzled Huang Chong with an offer to drink. The young man began to say something about how they had never drunk together and how the man had always cared for and protected him. Chong didn't suspect anything and was just touched. The guy took the rope out of his hands and insisted that they have a drink. They sat down to drink. The man complained about how he had suffered, and the young man apologized for not noticing his efforts. Meanwhile, the young man's sister was rushing to see him. The maid wanted to warn him of her arrival, but the girl did not want to distract her brother. She understood that he had a lot to talk about, but she came because she had heard rumors that her brother was leaving. Jong Hye remembered how her maid always did Hyun's hair nicely, but now he had outgrown it. She raised her head proudly and asked who the young man reminded her of, and the maid replied that of course he resembled a young lady. The girl stood in front of Hyun's house and heard arguments coming from inside about various events that the men had experienced. Jong Hye smiled and decided to go alone, so she allowed the maid to go rest. But the devoted woman could not leave her mistress alone, so she said she would wait with her. The girl gently tried to send her to rest, but the woman was only outraged that she was being treated like an old woman. Finally, when night fell, the young man carefully took his things and left the house, looking around to make sure there were no prying eyes. Finally, Hyun looked at Huang Chong, who was lying on the floor and threatening the void with his fists through his deep, drunken sleep. Old memories tormented his drunken brain, reminding him of how someone had offered him a bribe when he was still an inspector. The guy used a poison that dissipated internal energy, so until morning, the man would not be able to lift a finger to harm anyone. Hyun underwent treatment with various masks because his skin looked terrible due to the sharp loss of a large amount of weight, so he had to combine healing mud with bandages regularly. It was during one such procedure that the old doctor gave the young man a poison that blocked his internal energy. He gave it to him in case of an emergency, in case the boy encountered an opponent stronger than himself. It could help him buy some time, and right now, a few drops of this poison came in handy. Leaving the house, the young man hoped that the man would understand that he was doing this for Muramu and the Yu clan. But on the threshold, he saw his sister asking him if he would say goodbye to her. The girl stood sadly in the yard, holding her obviously pregnant belly. The boy was confused, not knowing what to do, because he had just gotten rid of Huang Chong. Suddenly, his sister rushed into his arms, begging him to be careful and come back soon. She emphasized that if things got tough, he could always come back because she and their father would always be waiting for him. After saying goodbye to his sister, Hyun went to the stable where a magnificent horse stood. His sister had told him about it. It was a lightning-fast horse, a gift from the emperor. It was recognizable by the unusual color of its eyes, which were bright blue. The young man could not even imagine that he would one day ride this lightning-fast horse. Finally, Yu Hyun looked at his family's estate in the moonlight and set off on his journey. The horse was indeed lightning fast, so by dawn, the young man was looking down from the mountain at Anho Hyunshan, the territory of the Namgung clan. The horse made animal sounds of joy, and the young man patted it on the neck and praised it for its good work. The young man stopped at the nearest tavern to the forest and ordered food for a whole company. Placing a silver boat on the table as payment, Hyun asked the owner of the establishment to bring him all the ginseng gatherers and hunters who knew Hyunshan like the back of their hands. At that time, a group of his mercenaries reported to the old gray-haired man that they had found pure ginseng in Anhui province, so the man did not hesitate to give the order to set off. The tavern owner quickly fulfilled Hyun's request, and after a while, all the people with the characteristics he needed were standing before him. They looked at the young man suspiciously and asked him about the purpose of his visit to their village. The boy looked very suspicious, so the people began to whisper, assuming that he was some kind of robber. Hyun immediately began to say that he was not strange at all and was not a robber, and almost blurted out that he was from the Yu clan. To save the situation, he said that he worked in the Anpin region for the Yu clan and introduced himself as Jin Weigen. According to legend, he was here to find something for the former military advisor to the emperor's son, Yu Sung-wan. The young man told rumors about a stone in Hyunsun that emitted a crimson light and asked if anyone had seen it. From the people's reactions, it was clear that this was the first time they had heard of such a thing. In his past life, Weigen himself did not believe his teachers when they told him about a stone that emitted a crimson color. But it seemed that one old man might know something, so Hyun pressed him a little. The man was not sure if it was crimson, but he knew of a red stone. He had seen it in his youth when he got lost in the mountains. The stone glowed like the sun, emitting a pillar of light. The young man asked sharply and loudly where it was, but the man just stood there scratching his beard. This place was deep in Hyunsun, on Pagoda Peak. For some reason, when he said this, everyone looked at the man with alarm. With a trembling voice, the other man began to dissuade the young man from going there because there was a fortress of 9 dragons. When they spoke of the 9 dragons fortress, they meant a band of robbers who had been outlaws since the time of the man's grandfather. He trembled as he spoke because there were rumors that some of them were skilled in martial arts. Hyun ignored the information about the danger and was happy to have found ginseng. The hiding place was perfect because no one in their right mind would go looking for it in the lair of the 9 dragons. The young man grabbed the old man by the hand, begging him to take him to the peak of the pagoda. The man tried to bring the boy to his senses and asked him to think again. But the young man had to go there, and if the man couldn't take him there, he should at least show him the way. The old man looked into Hyun's clear gray eyes and understood that this was very important to him. So, in the end, he agreed to take the young man to a place where he could see the peak. The man's name was Eksu, and his fellow villagers couldn't believe he had agreed. But he set a condition. The boy had to promise that they would return if something went wrong. Hyun immediately agreed and was very grateful for this. They set off right away, and Eksu took the boy to the place he had promised. To get further, they had to cross the river, which, although not wide, was so deep that the bottom was not visible, so the man advised them to go back for a boat. But the young man ignored all these warnings and only asked where the stone was. The man pointed to the place where he had seen it and added that when the sun set, the young man would be able to see its glow himself. Hyun simply waited. Eksu sat under a bare tree to take a nap, while the young man kept looking, waiting for the ginseng to reveal itself. When the sun began to set behind the rock, a small red glow appeared in the gorge. The man was worried about the young man, saying that night was coming and he should return. But the boy handed him a valuable item as a token of gratitude, and the man understood that he did not need to wait for him. Hyun did not want to take the man with him and put him in danger, because there could be robbers ahead whom he would not be able to defeat. Eksu began to say that the jewelry the young man had given him was too expensive, but the young man just thanked him and bowed. To the man's great surprise, the young man dived straight into the cold river from the cliff. No one would have thought that anyone would dare to swim across this river in winter, but Hyun was like a fish in water. The young man skillfully completed his task and found himself near the Nine Dragons Fortress. He accidentally overheard a conversation between two men discussing the quick sale of people they had caught on the border with Zhejiang province. The boy was a little annoyed by these conversations because he understood that these monsters had most likely plundered several villages. But now, the young man had other things to worry about. His task was to find pure ginseng, and he decided to use his spiritual energy to do so. Hyun let his energy search for his treasure. He would sense it if it was within a radius of at least 10 yards. But while he was searching for ginseng, he felt something strange. His energy saw a man pulling a girl out of the house by her hair, showering her with all kinds of insults. He threw the woman out onto the street and began kicking her, and Hyun almost jumped out from behind the bush, but suddenly stopped. Behind the door stood a small child crying, and the man turned to her with a smile. With trembling hands, the woman grabbed the man's leg and began to scream that after this, he could not call himself a human being. Then he turned around again and began to beat her, saying that he would see how long a real person could live. The young man's veins were boiling with rage, wanting to beat up the man who had raised his hand against a woman and a child, but he had to restrain himself. His masters had instructed him not to interfere until he regained his strength, even if it was a matter of justice and nobility. He could only watch the woman being beaten in order to save Murimu and prevent greater evil. The young man could no longer contain his rage and cursed his masters in his mind. Clutching the grass tightly in his hands, he promised himself that he would restrain himself only this once. As soon as he had the chaste ginseng, he would destroy all the scum he came across. Summoning all his willpower, the young man turned around and, amid the cries of the child and the sounds of beating, turned and left. But suddenly, inside, he heard the voice of his past life asking the young man what he was doing, because he had to follow the path he had chosen for himself. The young man could not stand aside from such a cruel crime. He saw no point in saving Murim if he continued to turn a blind eye to such cruel crimes. He looked back, thinking that in this case, it would be better to destroy Murim himself than to allow such horror to continue. After the man beat the woman who tried to stop him, he stretched his disgusting hand toward the little girl who was crying. But before he could touch her, a fist flew into his face, leaving a bloody mark. The young man looked at the blood on his sleeve and complained that he had stained his expensive clothes. The girl looked at her savior with wide eyes and cautiously asked if he had come to rescue them, but the young man said he was just passing by. The mother was trembling from the cold, the beatings, and fear, and rushing to her child, she asked the boy who he was. Hyun looked at them and reached out his hand, and the woman immediately covered her child, but the young man simply put his hand on their shoulders. The young man said they had no time, asked them to get up, and asked where the others were. The woman said they were inside the hut and pointed to it with her finger, at which point a robber came out of the building. Hyun quickly dealt with the second man and suggested that the girls enter the room before they were noticed. Stumbling over the threshold, the guy threw the robbers on the floor, complaining that they were very heavy. In the back of the room stood a group of frightened people, and the young man did not quite understand their reaction. Then it dawned on him that he looked a little scary with his bloody hands, but the young man explained that he had come to rescue them, and the woman confirmed his words. Waving his hand behind his back, the young man promised the people that he would get them out of there. One of the enslaved men cautiously asked if the young man was from the government, and the young man did not answer, asking if anyone knew how many people were in the fortress. The people saw about 50, which was a little more than the young man had expected, and the fact that there might be a martial arts master among them did not add to their joy. The captives began to ask if there were soldiers waiting around the fortress, and the young man said that one had come. The only thing he could offer them was to buy time for their escape, and everything else was up to them. At that moment, Hyun regretted 1,000 times that he had interfered in the events. They began to ask him what to do, and the woman he had just rescued said that now they would die anyway. The young man looked at the woman and felt a little better because he saw in her someone who could lead the crowd. Soon, another robber entered the building to hurry up the people who were still reluctant to leave. Suddenly, he froze when he saw his two companions on the floor and began to rage at the crowd. But he was not destined to rage for long because the next moment, Hyun twisted his neck with a martial arts move. The boy cautiously peered out onto the street to see who else might get in their way and saw a guard on a wooden tower. The man rubbed his eyes because it was late and he wanted to sleep, but at that moment he noticed a blue energy moving so fast that it looked like a blue river. It was a young man moving so fast that even light couldn't keep up with him. The man only had time to squint a little to see the idiot who had decided to climb up to them. But he didn't have time to take a good look because Hyun sent him to hell with one powerful blow to the base of the tower, which destroyed the high fortification. With a final scream, the man flew into the deep abyss surrounding the fortress. The people saw that the watchtower had been destroyed and realized that this was a signal for them. The woman whom the boy had left in charge gave the signal, and the people ran to meet their freedom. Meanwhile, Yoo Hyun finished his business and set fire to the entire main building. It was time to cause a little chaos. In the house where the other robbers were sleeping, there was loud snoring as everyone rested peacefully after a hard day's work. However, one man was awakened by the smell of smoke rising from the fire. Then it became clear that there was a fire. All the other men also began to wake up from the noise made by the robber. The first one to wake up wanted to run out and start putting out the fire, but as soon as he touched the doorframe, the explosion threw him back into the room. Everyone looked at the stranger standing in the doorway with a torch in his hands and began to angrily ask who he was. The young man was amused by such a stupid question and, mocking them, immediately said that he was the arsonist. A real commotion began. Everyone shouted that the young man was leaving and that he should be caught and cornered. They saw the boy running away and passed on to each other the description that he was bandaged and had come alone. Hyun assessed his strength and decided that fighting them together was too much, even though they were weak individually, but together they were easier to beat than his father. Finally, they noticed him. The young man regretted that he had not yet achieved the strength and energy absorption that would now help him cope in 2 seconds. Suddenly, an elderly man jumped out in front of the young man in an attempt to destroy the stranger. The young man managed to dodge the blow and responded with an elbow strike to the stomach. Hyun had no choice but to fight. Instead of a direct confrontation, he decided to direct his energy to his legs to move better and set a trap for the robbers. A pair of guards stood like 2 statues at the entrance to the robbers' village. Suddenly, a stone fell at their feet, and only then did they turn around and see a fire burning behind them. The bald man assumed that they were probably being attacked by an enemy, and when both realized that he had passed through them, they ran to the scene of the incident like bullets, because they did not want to get a beating from their boss. The people who had been sitting quietly all this time, waiting for the right moment, rushed to the exit as fast as they could. The woman, holding her child close to her chest, silently thanked the unknown soldier and asked him to take care of himself. At that moment, the young man was also running towards the exit. He had almost no energy left, but he decided to buy some more time for the people. Suddenly, a man with nunchucks and a tiger skin attacked him from the side. He was quite fast. Although the young man noticed the attack in time, he was still hit and thrown back. The man who attacked him was burly and bald. He asked who the young man was and what he was doing there. There were several other people with him, and they mocked the young man for his bandages, saying that he was hiding his ugly face under them. Hyun glanced around and realized that the men were trained in martial arts, which did not bode well for him. The burly man asked if the boy had come alone, and when he heard an affirmative answer, he laughed. In a moment, the young man was surrounded by other robbers who pointed their spears at him. Hyun clicked his tongue in dissatisfaction, of course, but then proudly crossed his arms over his chest, raised his head, and said that he didn't need help against such weaklings. Despite his confident appearance, the young man was extremely nervous and begged all the gods to scare them away with his words. The man sighed heavily and was indignant that so much noise had been made over one boy. Then Hyun realized that his plan had failed and that his blow had injured the young man too badly. Suddenly, the man yelled at his subordinates for standing there as if they were waiting for everything to burn to the ground. He yelled at his stupid people to go put out the fire, and they all rushed to carry out the task. The man decided to introduce himself as the head of the 9 Dragons Fortress, Gwak Sosun. The young man sarcastically asked if the man expected him to introduce himself now. But unexpectedly, the head was not annoyed by his words and said that he liked such people. He saw some kind of masculine strength in the young man and offered him a job. For Hyun, it was crazy that they were now going to recruit him, but he was glad that Gwak Sosun was stalling for time. He shocked everyone when he sat down in the middle of the conversation in the lotus position and asked if he was now being offered to become a mountain bandit. The young man began to scratch his chin and pretend to consider the offer while drawing spiritual energy from his surroundings. Gwak Sosun said that finding the right people was more difficult than it might seem at first glance, and that the young man was brave and strong and should be rewarded for that. Hyun still pretended to be thinking. The man said that he was trying in vain to impress them because he didn't even have any inner energy. He emphasized once again that he was offering the young man to join them and become equal to the other bandits, and then the man would turn a blind eye to this incident. Unlike their boss, his subordinates were not so patient, and seeing the boy's actions as disrespectful, they suggested that their leader finish him off or seriously maim him. Finally, the young man broke his silence and said that it sounded wonderful. Guak Sosun naively thought that the young man meant that he agreed with his proposal, but that was not quite the case. Hyun was glad to have finally regained some of his energy, so he stood up and said, "Since when does a wolf serve a mongrel?" The man instantly exploded with rage, calling the young man a freak, and veins appeared on his face from anger. The young man stood in a fighting stance, as if challenging the man to a one-on-one duel. But Guak was only angered that because of Hyun, he had to say banal things and ask his subordinates to beat the shit out of him. It didn't take long to get the robbers to attack the man, so they gladly did so. The young man just thought irritably that they were cowards because they were all attacking one person. The first blow that hit the young man cut his bandages, exposing his wrinkled face. Hyun mentally called the man a scoundrel who was hiding behind his subordinates. The attackers immediately began to mock him, saying that they thought he was young, but he turned out to be an old man or was pretending to be one. Hyun, with his youthful maximalism, replied that unlike the robbers, he at least looked like a human being. This, of course, enraged the men, and they attacked the young man even more fiercely. The young man did not use much force, but rather tried to outsmart and slip away, which did not work out very well for him. Since he was fighting several men alone, he had no time to rest because they all attacked him in turn. In the end, the young man still took a blow to his face and flew a couple of meters. Guak praised the young man, who had held out for quite a long time despite having no internal energy. Hyun wiped the blood from his chin and thought that he had energy, but now he definitely had none left. He realized that he had underestimated his opponents, who were clearly experienced warriors. The young man understood that it was a stupid mistake to try to save people when he was still so weak, and in the end, it was pointless to feel sorry for himself because he had helped them after all. The boy was trembling, but he got up. He couldn't die here, even if he lost his virgin ginseng. In the end, the young man straightened up with a heavy sigh, thinking that it was useless to dwell on old mistakes and that he had to focus on surviving. Seeing this, Guak So-sun smiled and said that he thought the boy was brave, but he turned out to be just a fool. So now he was of no use to him and he ordered his robbers to destroy him. Hyun managed to accumulate some energy and focused it on his legs to strengthen his center of gravity. After that, his body became light and could move like a stream of water. He skillfully scattered all the scoundrels, advising them to remember well the technique of the 8 drunken eternal steps. The young man was still far from his former form, but his movements impressed all the robbers, including the leader. This was only the beginning. Kaninghun was so fast that it was impossible to catch up with him. This technique allowed the body to be hyper-relaxed and fast. The young man rushed at Guak So-sun to deliver a fatal blow. But despite the incredible force of the blow, he only managed to slightly injure the man. The young man slipped past and threw himself into the abyss, sticking his tongue out at the robbers one last time. At the moment, he was no match for them, so he was forced to flee. He knew that the ravine was too deep for anyone to dare jump after him, so he gave them all the middle finger as a final gesture. The young man knew that he would return for their heads. Guak watched the boy flying down and called out his last words. His subordinates stood nearby in complete shock. The man ordered the robbers to find the young man's body because he wanted to skin him to let off some steam. Suddenly, another agitated robber ran up to the leader. The man asked sharply what news he had. The robber cautiously reported that only 2 charred corpses remained in the building where they were holding the prisoners. Guak immediately understood whose handiwork this was, and putting 2 and 2 together, concluded that the unknown young man was simply buying time for the prisoners. Skinning the boy was not enough for him now. He ordered his subordinates to search every corner of Hyeonsan and bring everyone back. Meanwhile, Hyun had almost reached the bottom, and he had only one attempt to land correctly. There was a pond below, so the young man just needed to position himself correctly for a softer landing. But the speed at which the boy was falling was too great, so he was afraid that he might crash into the bottom of the pond. Suddenly, Hyun realized that he had stopped instead of hitting the bottom. But things got much worse because the young man began to spin as he was pulled into a whirlpool. He couldn't get out of there easily, so his only chance was to trust the current, which he did. Waiting for the right moment, he managed to jump out of the whirlpool. Finally, the young man surfaced into the fresh air and began to greedily gasp for it, spitting out water as he did so. Once he had enough air in his lungs, Hyun lay down on the surface of the water. Now he wanted to rest a little and forget about all those ginseng roots. Suddenly, strange sensations tore him from his blissful slumber. His spiritual energy reacted on its own. He commanded the energy shining from his chest to quickly find the pure ginseng that was nearby. Hyun found himself in an unfamiliar place. He assumed that he had definitely fallen from the waterfall, but he did not know where he had ended up. In front of him, he saw a beautiful plant with a small bud on it. It must have been chaste ginseng. He remembered his teacher's words, who told the boy that he would recognize it immediately, but the young man thought he should ask for more details. But none of that mattered anymore because he had found it. Hyun came closer and began digging to get the root. After digging up the ground a little, the young man wrapped his arms around the stem of the plant and pulled out the root. Looking at it, he understood why the plant had such a name. It looked very much like a baby. The boy lifted it up, took a deep breath, and began to shake his head from the overload of emotions that overwhelmed him. Pressing the root to his cheek, he smiled like a fool, happy that the plans of the minion of chaos had come to an end. Looking around as if to check that no one was around, he thanked him for the gift. It would have been rude of him to just eat it, so he decided to do it with all due respect. The boy carefully took the root in both hands and cut off the first piece. He immediately felt the coolness of the leaves, the bitter taste of ginger on the tip of his tongue, sweet and refreshing, overflowing with spiritual energy. Hyun greedily took bite after bite until he had devoured the entire plant. The ginseng was overflowing with energy, and the young man absorbed it all and stood up, saying that now Guak Sosun had to beware of him. Feeling all the strength in his veins, he announced that the useless boy from Hwayan Prefecture had returned. Meanwhile, Hwang Chong, who had gone in search of his master, had already arrived at the village and was asking the shopkeeper about the boy who had visited them. From the description, it was definitely Hyun, but he introduced himself as Jin Weigen. Holding his cheek, which was clearly swollen, probably from the slaps of the patriarch of the Yu clan, the man wondered where the young master could have gone. When the man was fast asleep after drinking with the young master and even some tincture, Yu Song burst into the room. As soon as the man barely got up, he was hit in the face with an angry kick from the young master. The enraged father yelled at Hwang Chong for daring to fall asleep. The young master threatened to bury him so that he would sleep underground for as long as possible. Jun Woo, who always followed his father-in-law like a tail, tried to calm the man down a little, but when the patriarch looked at the bottles behind the servant, he couldn't stay calm. Hwang Chong, though hazy, began to remember how the young master poured him a drink with a smile and asked him to drink it all, and then everything was a blur. The man immediately realized that he had been deceived, and Mr. Yu's anger did not save him, even though he was being held not only by his son-in-law, but also by the doctor. Suddenly, Yu Song fell unconscious. Dr. Chang Seong carefully tried to find a pulse on his arm, but finding nothing, he cried out in alarm that the master had passed away. But the old man immediately came to his senses and began to hit the doctor on the head, calling him a liar, and drove everyone away. After that, Hwang Chong went in search of a young master. Suddenly, he heard a little boy talking about a horse with unusual eyes. In addition, he was picky about food. The boy searched all the neighboring villages for fruit for the animal. The man followed the boy and scared the child when he ran up shouting because he was calling his young master. He was already frantically running around and shouting in an attempt to find his master, not understanding that he had forgotten him in such a remote place. Finally, he grabbed the boy by the shoulders and in tears began to ask where this horse had come from. The child said that the animal's owner had gone to Pagoda Peak, where the fortress of the 9 dragons was located. The adults tried to stop him, but the young man said he was looking for something there. The man shouted even louder, scaring the boy when he realized that his master had gone to the mountain robbers. The worst-case scenarios were already forming in his mind, such as the boy being tied up, beaten, and laughed at. Having heard all the information he needed, Hwang Chong ran with a cry to save his master. But then he stopped abruptly, turned to the boy, and ran back to him, tripped over a rock, and like a ball bouncing off the floor, rolled over several times before falling. He forgot to ask where Pagoda Peak was, and, raising his head, asked while blood was still flowing from his nose. The people who managed to escape from their oppressive captivity cautiously and quickly fled through the snow-covered forest. Suddenly, they heard a branch crack and froze because there was a man standing behind a tree. When he came out of the shadows, it turned out to be Exu, who was helping people by showing them the shortest path to the village. The woman with the child thanked him sincerely, and in return, the old man asked if they had seen the boy in bandages. The woman turned to say something, and at that moment, a bright blue flash of lightning lit up the sky. Meanwhile, the team that Guak had sent to search for the body was already at the waterfall. The deputy head was there, and they told him that the body could have been carried downstream. Their boss would be very angry if they did not find the body, so they could not return without it. The deputy suggested they split up. 5 of them were to go down the river, while the others were to stay and search the surrounding area. When the group was about to leave the waterfall, one of them suddenly caught their attention and told them to look back. A young man was coming out of the waterfall, muttering something under his breath, saying that if everything had not gone according to plan, he might not have survived. The deputy stared at the young man in shock, not yet understanding who he was or where he had come from. The boy's face was covered by long, wet hair. He sarcastically asked if they had come to meet him, which was convenient because he was just about to go after them. All the robbers stood and blinked, not understanding who was standing in front of them. Pulling the hair away from his beautiful face, the young man asked indignantly if it was him they were looking for. After consuming chaste ginseng, all his excess skin disappeared, so the robbers simply did not recognize him and thought he was talking nonsense. Yun just laughed. He was tired of fooling around and told the men to take off their clothes because he was cold. This annoyed the robbers. They didn't think it was okay to talk to them like that if they hadn't beaten him up yet. The young man calmly asked if they were going to take off their clothes or not, and added that they should not force him to use force. The deputy was stunned by such insolence and decided to teach the boy a lesson, but he didn't even have time to touch him before he received a good kick to the jaw. His subordinates stood with their mouths agape as their boss fell into the water from the blow. The young man took off his clothes, looked them over and said with dissatisfaction that he should have been more careful because now he was wet too. When the young man looked at the men, they began to tremble with fear. This was because the young man was looking at them with the beautiful face of a god and asking who to undress next. Everyone quickly took off their clothes and gave them to the stranger, not wanting to get themselves into trouble. On top of that, the young man took their halberds, which turned out to be much heavier than he thought. Suddenly, the young man swung the weapon and cut off the head of the one standing closest to him. While the robbers looked in surprise at the body of their comrade, which had fallen limply, the young man asked them with a smile what had happened and whether they would continue to stand rooted to the spot. Yun didn't really care. He planned to destroy them anyway. The robbers trembled with cold and fear and begged for mercy. But the young man, with a beautiful smile, said he did not want to, and promised to take each of their heads. Stammering with fear, one of the robbers dared to ask who the young man had made such a promise to. Swinging his sword for another blow, the young man said that he had made this promise to himself. Hearing this, the men rushed in all directions to flee, but it did not help them. Without moving from his spot, Hyun decapitated everyone who tried to escape with a single blow. With the eyes of a beast, he ran forward, saying that it was time to hunt because the robbers were animals, not people. When the young man finished, he stood wiping the blood from his face. He had just changed his clothes and already stained them. Sitting down in front of the river to wash his face, he saw a beautiful face in the reflection and did not immediately recognize himself. He quickly realized that it was the effect of the chaste ginseng, and now he understood why they did not recognize him. Now his skin was so supple and soft. Holding his beautiful face, he called the former owner of the body a fool for disfiguring such beauty, but now everything had turned out wonderfully, albeit riskily. Remembering his beautiful sister, he recalled the rumors and realized that with such a face, no one would think he was adopted. Such a beautiful moment of self-admiration was suddenly interrupted by a flock of birds that flew up in fear. Shouts could be heard in the distance. The robbers had found people who were fleeing slavery. One of them was already whipping X for helping them. While the captives stood bound again, the robber beat the old man and demanded an answer as to whether he was in league with the unknown young man. The man covered his face with all his might from the beatings and denied the theory of collusion, but they still beat him and did not believe him. When the scoundrel made another attempt to strike the old man, he suddenly stopped. In the distance, he saw his servant Wu-tae and froze, not understanding what he was doing there. The young man bent down, and the robbers thought he was collecting snow. They had no idea what the boy was going to do. The boy was indeed making a snowball, and then, in response to the robbers' various questions, he threw one. The snowball flew past one of them and hit the other in the face, and the blow was so strong that the man fell immediately. The one who had been beating the poor old man could only look around and watch as his companions fell one after another. After knocking out all but the last one, Hyun shouted "Strike!" joyfully and picked up the halberd he had placed on the snow a little earlier. The young man jumped 8 meters into the air and flew toward the robbers while they were still trying to figure out what to do in the commotion. Someone ordered them to scatter, but the young man said it was too late for that. He landed proudly next to one of the corpses, scattering the other robbers who stared at him in bewilderment with a shockwave. The young man beheaded everyone standing there, conjuring his weapon to cut through the clouds and the moon. Hyun smiled and pointed his halberd at the only one left and asked if he was afraid. Revealing a little, he said that this was the sword technique of the Wooden clan. The man trembled and asked the young man who he was. Sighing heavily, the young man asked how they could forget the one they had mocked. Hyun was distracted from his fight with the scoundrels by the sounds he heard. An old man was groaning in the snow, and the captives were trying to help him. The young man immediately recognized the old man, X, who had agreed to take him to a place where he could see the peak. The smile disappeared from the boy's face. He was filled with energy fueled by his rage and sternly asked who had done this to the old man. The robber, who had fallen into the snow, began to stammer and justify himself, saying that he hadn't even touched him. But Hyun was not going to listen to him. He just swung his weapon once, and the man was cut in half. The young man slowly approached the old man, and the captives began to beg for mercy in unison. The young man said not to confuse him with those scoundrels and carefully lifted the old man, asking him if he was okay. The old man barely opened his eyes, and although he could not see his face, he clearly recognized his silhouette. The young man sternly but gently reminded him that he had asked him to return. Yun decided to let some of his energy flow into him and slowly heal him. It wasn't a complete cure, but once his condition stabilized, he should get better. This should be enough for first aid. Having finished his work, the young man asked if anyone could help carry the old man. 3 volunteers carefully lifted the man and carried him on their backs. The young man instructed them to walk forward slowly and carefully without turning around. Now, they could walk calmly because there would be no pursuit behind them. From now on, Hyun announced that he would unleash the wrath of the gods on those beasts. To seal his promise, he broke his halberd and made a sword out of it. 2 guards stood at the entrance to the bandits' village. They heard the sound of lightning and could not understand how it appeared in winter. But it wasn't just lightning, something had landed in front of them. It was Yu Hyuk, who immediately destroyed the men as soon as the smoke from the landing cleared. The young man stood in the middle of the street and shouted the name of the bandit leader, Gwak Sosun, at the top of his lungs. But instead of the man, a bunch of other people came out. Internal energy, depending on its amount, had a limit to its awakening, but spiritual energy was different. It had the power of life. It pierced and destroyed everything in its path. The young man was going to use it so that Gwak would no longer cause problems for anyone. After destroying another attacker, he informed everyone else that the same fate awaited them. The young man destroyed dozens of people at once, so those who remained just stood and trembled. Yun stood and smiled. He saw the fear in the robber's eyes, so now they were no longer a threat to him. Suddenly, the attack on the boy continued as arrows flew at him, which the young man skillfully dodged. Gwak Sosun arrived with his archers and ordered his other subordinates to keep their distance. Everyone gladly obeyed him and increased the distance between them, but they surrounded the boy. The young man just laughed and said he was glad to see the man because he had been wondering where he was while his warriors were dying like flies. He mocked him and said that it looked as if the man had become afraid and brought in ordinary hunters. Yun said that this should not have been done, as the outcome was already known, and it would only delay things a little. He said that it would not save them from death, and the robbers began to tremble at these words. The boy advised them not to resist and was already swinging his sword when he heard a familiar voice ordering the mountain bandits to stop. It was Huang Chong, who was walking with a small company of soldiers and ordered them to kill all the robbers. A fight broke out, and the man also took part in it. Hyun noted that he was quite skilled and worthy of the title of leader of the Yu clan. Gwak Sosun shouted at his subordinates to stop the invasion at all costs. He himself ran away so fast that his heels lit up, leaving his subordinates to fight for him. Yun took it upon himself to take care of the man and caught up with him when he was already at the gate, asking him where he was running to, since he was on the verge of death anyway. Gwak turned around and asked why the young man was chasing him. Then the young man laughed that he still hadn't been recognized. The young man smiled and showed his middle finger, reminiscent of the gesture he made that night when he jumped into the abyss. Then Sosun instantly realized who was in front of him, but he couldn't help but be surprised because the young man's face was completely different. Yun said it was thanks to a mystical plant, but he didn't go into details because the man wouldn't understand anyway. The man began to tremble, realizing that he was facing a martial arts master against whom he had no chance. So he decided to make the only obviously correct decision and knelt down to beg for mercy. The young man just laughed at the fact that the man had finally understood his place. The man promised to give the young man anything from money to women in exchange for mercy, but the young man told him to shut up. He asked if Gwak had spared anyone just because they begged him to. He robbed ordinary people, kidnapped women and children, and abused them. The young man asked if anything had ever stopped the man, and then he realized that he could not beg for forgiveness now. Yun swung his sword and said that there was no forgiveness and that he was passing sentence in the name of heaven, and that the man had only the option of accepting it with dignity. With one swift movement, the young man cut off his head and, looking at the body of the scoundrel, thought only of how much grief he had brought to people and how easily he had gotten away with it. Suddenly, Huang Chong approached him and cautiously asked if the boy was all right. He did not recognize his young master and said that the young man was obviously angry with the robbers and that he was a young but ruthless warrior. Yun smiled and was about to respond cheerfully, but Huang interrupted him mid-sentence. He was very concerned about finding his young master and asked Hyun if he had seen him. Not understanding who he was talking to, Huang began to describe the boy in his own words, but with considerable stupidity, stubbornness, and a complete lack of manners. He added to all the characteristics that he eats like a cow and is rude. Behind the boy's smile was a wild desire to bury the man alive right there. As soon as the young man confessed, Hwang immediately changed his tune and began to praise Hyun, saying that he had become incredibly handsome during the time they had not seen each other, and that he had recognized him immediately. This annoyed the young man greatly because he remembered the characteristics the man had given him a few minutes ago. The warriors of the Yu family were amazed at the young man's abilities, because even they had found it difficult to fight the legendary robbers of the Nine Dragons Fortress, and he had dealt with them all by himself. And although his fighting methods were somewhat brutal, no one intended to punish him for it. Hwang Chong said that the head of the Heavenly Squad had come for the young man himself and asked him to return because his father was very worried about his son. The man played on his pity, hinting at his difficult situation because the young man should have known his father's character. But Hyun still could not return because he had to catch the person who would come for the ginseng first. Suddenly, the young man noticed an incredible glow of joy on the man's face. The former inspector had a rope in his hands and decided to recall his younger years and catch the criminal again. Hyun understood that he was now playing the role of the criminal and began to back away, persuading Hwang Chong to stop because then he would not hold back either. But the man did not back down, so the young man began to run away, and the nimble old man deftly grabbed his leg with the rope. He reminded the boy that he used to be the chief inspector of intelligence. The man pulled the rope toward himself, but the young man was not deterred and decided to attack, his fist touching Hwang Chong's palm. One of the warriors who came to the rescue was surprised that the young man had achieved such results, that he was on par with the one who was once called the Destroyer. But after a barrage of further attacks, it became clear that he even surpassed him. The young man delivered numerous quick blows to the man, throwing him back dozens of meters. But suddenly, the boy was attacked from behind, his legs tied with a rope. Looking back, the young man saw one of the warriors apologizing to his master, but saying that he had to obey orders. Freeing himself from the rope, the boy said that this was quite mean, but the man assured him that they were simply devoted to their goal. They could not retreat, so they released their inner energy and prepared to attack the young man again. But the battle was not meant to begin, because suddenly they were disturbed by an old man, Eksu, who came with a cane and the help of a young man. Coming closer, he bowed to Hyun and said that he was worried that he would not have time to thank him. The young man smiled awkwardly and replied that it was not necessary. The young man who was with the old man was his son, and he sincerely thanked the boy for saving his father. These words touched Hyun's soul. It was pleasant and unusual to hear them, and he tried to say that he did not need thanks. Eksu said that he had followed the Heavenly Squad precisely because he wanted to thank the young man personally. He also said that those who had been taken hostage were also infinitely grateful to him. The young man asked anxiously if the people had survived. They continued to thank him for defeating the robbers and saving not only the man and the captives, but also their family. Hyun stood frozen, watching the happy old man and his son walk back to the village, and he was overcome with an unusual feeling of warmth. This feeling was somewhat similar to weakness, and he thought that he had expended too much spiritual energy. At that moment, his father's loyal subordinates wrapped him in ropes and dragged him home. As they rode in the carriage, the young man shouted the whole way, begging Hwang Chong to let him go, arguing that the future of Murimu was in his hands. The man agreed with him without taking his words seriously and said that it was worth thinking about the peace of the Yu family. Hyun chewed on the rope in irritation because it was obvious that his arguments were futile. He planned to avoid Hwang Chong until the servant of chaos appeared. The man grew tired of the young master's fussing and, saying that he was only looking out for him, touched a point on his neck and sent the boy into a deep sleep. Hyun fell asleep, muttering something about the danger of Murim, a big mistake, and the servant of chaos. One of the warriors of the Heavenly Squad expressed his surprise that the young man had such a childish face but was able to defeat an entire squad of robbers single-handedly. Suddenly, Hwang asked not to mention the young master in the report about the fight with the 9 dragons. The warrior was surprised by this request because it was not so easy for Murim to earn such a merit. But that was precisely why the man asked, because the more famous his name became, the more attention he would attract, and as we know, a nail that sticks out gets hammered down. The warrior laughed and said that the guard Hwang really cherished his young master, but he decided to listen to the man, and since the young master had used the name Jin Weigen, people would talk about this man in general. Hwang Chong turned and looked anxiously at the young master Yu, who was sleeping behind him. Now he was safe. Meanwhile, the chief arrived with his warriors at the place where the chaste ginseng had previously grown. He was furious because the young ginseng that was intended for the young master had disappeared. The man's rage caused everything around him to shake. His soldiers begged him to stop, but his anger spread like poison. When he calmed down a little, he turned to one of his subordinates named Ma Huan. The young man was breathing heavily from his master's unconscious attack. But he responded to the request in a moment. The man raged, saying that a thief had been there. The situation in the Golden Palace left much to be desired, so he had to return to his young master immediately and entrusted the matter to Ma Huan. The young man was terrified by his master's order. He said that if the thief had already swallowed the plant, he had to cut open his stomach and take the precious ginseng. He was to kill all his relatives, if he had any, and if he found any friends, he was to deal with them and their families. In general, he had to destroy everyone connected with him. After a while, Hyun gradually came to his senses and regretted the lost chance to destroy the accomplice of chaos on the spot. Then he could have spent the rest of his years in luxury and wealth without any worries. Wang Chong smiled and told the young master that they had already arrived, but the young man yelled at him for missing his chance. The man did not listen to him at all and said that Yu Song could not bear to be separated from his son and had gone to Anhui. Hyun accepted what had happened, especially since the scoundrels could not have failed to notice anything after such a commotion. In any case, he had accomplished his first task when he took the pure ginseng from them. He had another chance to catch his accomplice when he came for the second spiritual creature, the 1,000-year-old shell. Lost in such thoughts, he did not notice how quickly they had arrived in the city of Hefei. The man said that the young man was probably in such a big city for the first time. Hefei is the capital of Anhui, and it was indeed a novelty for the boy after he left the Huani Slope, which was engulfed in the flames of chaos, and his world became quite limited. All he had seen were training halls and spaces created with the help of formations. Only now did he have the opportunity to see the real world, a lively city full of interesting infrastructure. Passing by the commercial district, the boy saw a bunch of merchants selling various goods he had never seen before. The city was alive and bright, a bunch of lights, people waiting for the market to open to visit the delicacies and look into the shop where new silk had been delivered. Wang Chong promised to untie the young man if he didn't run away. Hyun said he wasn't a child and wasn't going to do anything silly. He felt incredibly cramped and uncomfortable being tied up. At the entrance to the Namgung family palace was an inscription that read, "Imperial Court." Such audacity was typical of this clan. The boy confidently stepped forward with a smile, but a sword was held to his throat and he was ordered to stop. He barely managed to keep from rolling his eyes, remembering that he had already been in a similar situation. But the guards were quickly ordered to back off by Yu Song, who was walking behind him. The young man looked at his father and thought that he was quite loving and caring, as all his fears for his son were reflected on his face. He decided to pretend to be a good son today and went to hug his father, but the man, angry, walked past him. He yelled at Huang Chong, accusing him of deceiving him and asking where his son was, because the man had written in his letter that they would arrive together. While Yu Sung shook the man by the collar, he tried to say something to him. Pausing for a second and glancing at Hyun, he continued to yell at the man, asking how this skinny, pretty robber could be his son. While old man Yu was yelling, the boy decided to make one more attempt and turned to his father. At that moment, the man recognized his son's voice and rushed to him, enveloped in blissful love. During dinner, the warrior of the Heavenly Squadron said that at first they learned that Jin Wigan was behind the robbery, but in fact, the young Lord Yu had dealt with all the robbers on his own. Chong Sung could not believe what he was being told because he knew very well from stories what his cousin looked like. The man asked if they had made a mistake, but the warrior was certain and added that when they tried to bring him back, they barely managed to do so, and that was thanks to the guard, Huang Jonggu. Namgun Hansu, who was sitting opposite his father, yelled at the head of the Heavenly Squad for daring to tell such tales in front of them, and said that they were simply careless when they caught the boy, which is why it was difficult for them. The warrior objected, saying that they had only refrained from using fatal techniques and had otherwise made every effort. The man blurted out something about checking it out, and his father immediately confused him by calling him short-sighted. If he had pushed his only son who would inherit a good family, who was like an uncut diamond and had innate martial arts abilities, into the background. And what's more, he had become more handsome after losing weight, according to rumors. So how else could such a vehement objection be called anything other than narrow-mindedness? The head of the family stood up and sternly said that from now on, he would decide the matter of marriage himself and advised the boy not to interfere. Yun Yu Sung and his brother Chong Sung gathered at the same table. The young man sat and complained in his thoughts that the men had been drinking since morning. He was bored, his legs were numb, and he didn't know what to do there. Suddenly, his father put a glass on the table and told his son to take the state military exam. This was not at all convenient for the young man, as he had barely escaped from his family, and government service had much stricter requirements. Surprisingly, Hansu stood up for him, saying that if the boy took a military position, he would only be able to train according to strict guidelines, and no matter how talented he was, the highest he could achieve in his career was the rank of general. Yun looked at the old man with narrowed eyes. He didn't know what he was thinking, but for now, he was satisfied with this line of reasoning. Suddenly, he said that if the boy found a good teacher, he would achieve greater results than a general and become the savior of the state. Yusun really liked the idea of such fame for his own son, and he asked where they could find a worthy teacher. The man asked his brother who they were going to look for when such a master was right in front of them. Namgung Changseon, the king of the sword and former head of the Namgung family, sat and smiled, offering his services. Hyun smiled because he understood what was happening. A martial arts genius and someone who single-handedly defeated a band of robbers is the dream of any teacher. Everyone wants a student like that. Unlike the other 9 schools, the Namgung family gave the impression of being strong supporters of earthly existence. Nevertheless, it was one of the most famous families that had belonged to Murim for many years. By borrowing the name of the Namgun family, the boy could have had a good career in Murim, and most importantly, it was an opportunity to distance himself from the Yu family. There was only one problem left. He had to persuade his caring father. But judging by his shining eyes, he was happy with his brother's offer to teach his son. Chang Seong grabbed his brother's hand and began to gush about how Hyun was like a son to him. Not just like a son, but he really was like a son to him. The young man watched this circus in surprise. Yuson said he was worried when he heard about the emperor's anxiety, but when his brother agreed to look after Hyun, he became incredibly happy. The man wondered for a moment why the emperor was worried, but then assumed that he was concerned about the future of the throne. In that case, the emperor wanted the Yu clan to remain close to his heir, but Yu Song was already very old and did not have much strength left. Then the flattery began, and Chang Seong assured his brother that it was all because of the emperor's deep trust in him. Yun, who was sitting nearby and watching all this, was already bored of listening to these old men's conversations. After a while, Yu Song went home with tears in his eyes, instructing his son to obey his uncle and work hard in training. Among his instructions were advice not to skip meals, to write twice a week, and if his son missed home cooking, to be sure to mention it. Hyun stood politely smiling and wondering when his father would finally leave. Finally, the horses were whipped and the carriage began to move. The young man sighed with relief. That wasn't the end of it. Yu Sung and Huang Chong looked out of the moving carriage, waving goodbye to the boy and radiating some strange glow of love and kindness that was already starting to make him feel sick. Still, the young man smiled sincerely despite their overprotectiveness. He appreciated his father's love and Huang Chong's devotion. As soon as the carriage drove away, Sang-son addressed his nephew in a stern tone and told him to follow him. Hyun was a little confused that they would start training right away. The man began by showing the boy around the city. He smiled warmly, and all the locals bowed politely and respectfully to the gentleman. They came to a building where 2 guards stood, and the uncle sternly ordered his nephew to climb the stairs. The sun had already set, and the 2 of them climbed up to the stone fortress. Suddenly, the man took a light step and flew up several meters. Hyun could not have expected anything less from a great swordmaster. He saw with his own eyes the step of the great void. Even his lousy teacher did not possess such a level of qinggong. With this step, the man easily climbed onto the roof. He turned to the young man and, asking why he was standing there, ordered him to follow him. The young man thought for a moment. His opponent was the King of Swords, and he couldn't use Kabin's Chingu. A picture immediately formed in his mind of how they would question him about his connection to the scoundrel Kabin, and Hyun didn't even have an answer. So, after thinking for a moment, he decided to use something else, and, crouching down, pushed off with his hand to make a jump. His uncle laughed and said that the boy had excellent control over his body. Hyun bowed politely and said that he was too kind to him. Looking at the view of the city from the roof, Chang Sung asked his nephew if he had noticed the roads on the way here, and when he received an affirmative answer, he asked how many places the boy thought the man had been to. Hyun became nervous for a moment, assuming that the man might be testing his observation skills by deliberately confusing him. He was too relaxed. They had passed only 64 places. Hyun immediately began to apologize for thinking too narrowly and not being able to notice. The man continued talking and said that all of this belonged to the Namgun family. The young man listened attentively, and only after a second did he realize what he had heard. Chang Seong pointed to a gazebo in the distance and asked if the young man could see it. With his next sentence, he shocked Hyun by stating that everything from there belonged to the Namgung family. All these vast, boundless spaces, the entire city, the entire territory belonged to the Namgung family. The man smiled and boasted about his possessions, while the boy stood there trying to understand what he was hinting at. The uncle turned to his nephew and asked, pointing to all the wealth, how he liked it. Hyun froze with a stupid expression on his face, not understanding why he was being asked all these questions. He assumed that his new teacher wanted him to run back and forth to further appreciate the grandeur of the Namgun family's wealth. The man laughed as he watched the boy get ready to run and asked if he still didn't understand, even after seeing all this. The young man had already decided to start, but the man stopped him by grabbing his leg with his inner energy, so instead of a sharp start, the boy hit his head on the roof like an ostrich. Yun lost his chance to solve the riddle on his own, and, raising his head, asked for mercy and for everything to be explained to his clumsy nephew. After laughing a little and smiling sincerely, Chang Sun said that some of them could go to him. The young man froze with his mouth agape. He thought he would hear anything but that. With a smile, he said that as soon as the young man married he would take full responsibility and give part of this treasure as a dowry. The young man covered his mouth with his hand so as not to say anything unnecessary when he realized why he had been brought here. There was no trace of the stern look when the young man asked if they had come here to talk about it. Yun was simply speechless, but what else could he expect from the old man who was trying so hard to take advantage of him? The man was beaming when he told the young man not to worry because he would work something out with he. But the young man didn't listen to him and just jumped off the roof. He wasn't going to listen to any nonsense about marriage. The old man immediately ran after the boy and said with a devilish smile that if that wasn't enough, he would add more. At that moment, the noble martial arts genius was unexpectedly overtaken by the image of the crazy old man from Vegan's past life. The uncle blocked the boy's path and began to persuade him to marry his granddaughter, saying that then most of Namgun's treasures would go to him. Yun interrupted him and said he had no intention of getting married. In his arguments, he reminded him that he was the heir to the Yu family and that all the treasures belonged to his family. Moreover, the emperor greatly respected the boy's father and from time to time gave him jewels. The merchant guilds were willing to give him anything he wanted, so there was no point in him marrying into the Namgun family for their property. He said that he was the first and only son of such a large family, so he could forget about the wedding. The disappointed young man left, saying that he thought Sang Son would teach him. The man realized his mistake because he overlooked the fact that the boy was born with a diamond spoon in his mouth and did not need jade. But that didn't mean he would give up because he was the one who had achieved this position with only a sword. When others hit a wall and gave up, he was the king of the sword. The man took note that Hyun was interested in martial arts. So the next day, early in the morning, the devil showed his nephew some techniques while he sat there, not understanding what could be done so early in the morning. When Chang Seong showed him all the moves, he said that this was the art of the royal sword and asked if the young man was impressed. But the boy saw nothing amazing in it and thought only that old people sleep less but are full of energy. The uncle continued his attempts to impress Hyun and used the sword to subdue the energy in a tree. But even then, the young man only thought that this winter tree was too expensive. He tried to show him something else, but eventually got tired and stopped because he was sure he had shown him enough. So he hinted that the family's martial arts teachings were only passed on to direct descendants. He added that if the boy got married, he would pass them all on to him. Hyun understood what was going on and simply left. His uncle rushed to his nephew and asked him to think carefully because this was the martial art of the Namgun clan, which he could not buy even with money. Chang Seong suggested that the young man try to master the martial art because the Namgun family had few exalted martial truths. But the young man indifferently said that he saw nothing interesting in it. Surprisingly, the man was not offended by these words but only laughed at them. He understood that even though Hyun had a talent for fighting, he had only recently begun his martial arts training, so it might seem to him that everything was simple and that martial arts were different from what he saw. The man began a philosophical speech about how martial arts had been perfected over several hundred years, from generation to generation, and even adding one step changed everything. Suddenly, the young man interrupted him and said that it looked easy to repeat. This offended the uncle, and the young man was not averse to showing his skills. Yun picked up a stick lying on the floor, thinking that he would finally be able to distract the annoying old man from his marriage. He had managed to learn the Namgun family's martial arts while being beaten by the master. Since rumors about him had already spread, nothing would change if he pretended to be a genius again. The boy began to wave his sticks and say that it was something like that. His uncle immediately called his nephew a fool and said that martial arts were no joke. But the next moment, he saw that the young man was indeed accurately reproducing the movements and filling them with energy. Chang Son stood with his mouth open, unable to believe how the child in front of him had mastered the art of the royal sword. He abruptly ordered the boy to stop and began shouting, asking what this meant and where he had learned this technique. Hyun looked at him as if he were an idiot and said that the man himself had just shown it to the boy. Then the man realized that he had underestimated the young man because it took him only one glance to perfectly master the art of the royal sword, which was passed down only in the Namgun family. This meant that he was standing before a genius the world had never seen before. Chang Seong froze in place, thinking everything over. The boy noticed that his uncle had become a little strange, as if he had gone into himself and forgotten how to blink, so he tried to rouse him. In the end, he decided to seize the moment, threw down his stick, and left, saying that he would not marry. But a cunning spark of excitement lit up in the man's eyes when he saw a real treasure in human form, and he finally decided to marry his granddaughter He to him. Meanwhile, a team of 3 people led by Ma Huan arrived in the city to search for the root thief. From the tavern owner, they learned about a young man who had arrived 2 days earlier and immediately began searching for those who knew the mountain slope and the red stone. From him, the squad learned that the young man's name was Jin Weigan. Now they knew the name of the enemy they were looking for. Early in the morning, Nam Gung Song was already standing at the gate to Hyun's room, calling for his younger uncle. When he appeared at the door, Seong asked why the boy was still there, knowing that training was starting today. Yawning, Hyun said that he did not need to learn the intricacies of the Namgung family and said that his nephew could enjoy it on his own. This surprised the boy, and he gave his uncle a stern look and ordered him to follow him quickly. Hyun smiled sweetly as he looked at him. Before, that look had filled him with horror, but now his master looked like a sweet boy. His uncle did not like his nephew, even though he had heard from his grandfather about his incredible talent and ability to repeat techniques after seeing them only once. Physical data was not a guarantee of success. A true master had to not only train the body, but also diligently hone his inner energy, starting from the age of 1. But Sun did not feel his uncle's naegong, who had already turned his back and walked away, saying that he would rather rest a little longer. The angry young man put his hand on Hyun's shoulder and told him that he should go with him while he was still talking nicely and calling him his respected uncle. The boy was amused that his teacher was digging his own grave with his own hands. He turned back with a smile, looked at his nephew, and thought that perhaps this was a good opportunity to try to teach his student. Hyun shook the boy's hand off his shoulder and asked if he would teach him, because at the moment he had nothing to teach the boy. He expressed his desire to teach his nephew. From the outside, it seemed strange because Sun was older and taller than his uncle. The boy exploded with rage and shouted that he called the young man uncle and behaved politely, but did not understand where the boy's arrogance came from. Hyun enjoyed teasing the boy and asked him what was wrong with his face and whether he was going to beat him up or take him to training. Sun clenched his fist tightly in an attempt to restrain himself, but his uncle finished him off by urging him to try if he could, of course, and calling him his nephew. Hyun laughed, pretending he hadn't said anything, but only called his nephew his nephew. Sun couldn't hold back, calling the guy a psycho and a bully and saying that his insolence was simply piercing the heavens. The boy was shaking with rage, and his uncle stood there surprised that he hadn't gotten more than a few insults out of the young man. He was disgusted by such polite language. Looking at Hyun's face contorted with rage, he realized that his provocation had not been in vain, but for full effect, it was worth pushing a little further. Then the uncle turned to his nephew, and in order to become even more familiar, addressed him informally. He asked if the boy knew anything more offensive than rude. Sun didn't know what to do in this most shameful moment of his life. He had never sworn before, and besides, no one had ever dared to insult him. Hyun knew his teacher as a person who came up with new insults every day and swore like a devil, so he thought that this was something he had learned from childhood, but he was obviously a little mistaken. No one could defeat Namgu-sun with a sword, so his second name was the King of the Seven Senses sword. Every person has 7 emotions: anger, joy, disgust, love, sadness, fear, autior, and pleasure, and Namgun-sun was the one who embodied them in martial arts. He assumed that this was why his teacher beat him in the morning because of his bad mood. And during meals, the poor young man was beaten with laughter and good humor. When it rained, the teacher beat him and grieved with tears in his eyes. It was incredibly difficult to adapt to that difficult character, which changed 12 times a day. And now he didn't know what to do with this young gentleman who had reached the peak of his emotions but continued to restrain himself. At this rate, one of Murima's heroes could simply disappear. Hyun couldn't let that happen. The boy grabbed his head. He had been given a problematic student and he only wanted to help him grow up, but now he would have to shape his character as well. Smiling like a madman, he said that the work ahead would be very difficult. San didn't understand the meaning of his young uncle's words, but Hyun explained that when he beat him, he would understand everything. The young man approached the boy quickly and easily, and the boy recognized in these movements the gate of the heavenly wind. Sun stood firmly on the ground, swung his fist, and said he would show the boy the difference between the original and the fake. He began to deliver many quick blows. Hyun dodged them, of course, but noticed that his nephew was not a bad fighter, but too straightforward. Dodging the attack, the boy delivered his own kick, doing a somersault in the air. Sun flew several meters away. Then his uncle asked him what he was going to do with such poor defense. The young man saw that the boy was rushing at him with his fist and decided to take a defensive position. The uncle, who was swinging his fist, asked with a smile if his nephew had decided to repel him with his inner energy and if his plan would work. The punch landed. Sun couldn't believe that, taking advantage of his opponent's momentary mistake, the guy had struck and broken through his armor. At the moment of reaching the limit, he provoked an explosion of energy, increasing the force of the blow, just like in the Namgun family's fist technique. With a smile, Hyun used a thunderous explosion and threw his nephew so far that he broke through the wall. The young man lay in the rubble of the wall and laughed, wiping away the blood. He did not understand how his uncle used this technique because he knew that the young man had not mastered his inner strength. He assumed that it was enough for him to just look in order to master Chi. In such circumstances, it was indeed a talent sent from heaven. Hyun approached his nephew and stood in front of him, rubbing his fists and saying that he still had a long way to go. Sun quickly realized that something bad was waiting for him, and indeed, they began to beat all the nonsense out of the boy. Hyun was beaming with happiness as he mocked Namgung's son and said that he couldn't imagine how long he had been waiting for this day. Covering himself from the blows and begging them to stop, the noble gentleman began to curse the boy, calling him a scumbag and worse, and asked them to stop because it hurt. The boy paused for a moment and then, with a smile, said the same thing he had once heard from his master. He explained to Sun that this was anger and that this was how their anger was vented. And the poor, beaten young man continued to swear and shout, not understanding what nonsense his uncle was talking about, with a satisfied face and tears of joy in his eyes. Finally, Hyun delivered the final blow that knocked the boy out. He turned out to be weak, and the young man thought about feeding him the remains of the treasure. By the way, he had to start looking for the next spiritual creature, and for that, he had to find an accomplice. But nothing came to mind yet. He didn't remember anything related to that damned servant, but he remembered something else. He remembered someone who knew where the second spirit of that man was. His name was Hwang Doksum. He was soon to appear in the prison of the Cheonmu Union. Doksum's meeting with the Servant of Chaos was to take place in 6 months. The young man planned to appear at the right moment and behead the servant who would come to meet Hwang Doksum. This should prevent chaos from occurring, and then the young man's suffering would come to an end. The young man thought about it for a while. He had no guarantee that some variable would not suddenly appear. So, to be prepared for the unexpected, he decided that he needed to train his teachers and lifted the unconscious son onto his shoulder. Hyun ran ahead, saying that this time the Servant of Chaos would definitely not escape him. After a while, Namgung's son came to his senses and, holding his head, wondered how someone could beat a person so badly. Calling his uncle a scumbag, he thought about doing anything to get revenge on him. Suddenly, Hyun appeared from the darkness behind him with a bright smile. Seeing that his nephew had regained consciousness, he asked him what he was muttering about him under his breath. Sun immediately began to nervously deny it, saying that his uncle had misheard him because he would never dare to say such a thing. Hyun didn't really listen and immediately asked why the young man was so shaky and cut him off with a couple of punches for half a day. The young man told the elders that they had had a little sparring match so as not to raise any unnecessary questions. Sun nervously adjusted his collar and thought that it was a pure beating and not a sparring match. Hyun said with a sincere smile that his uncle had ordered them to train together and that he was better than his nephew. Sun was not very happy when he realized that he would now be training one-on-one with Yoo Hyun. That's how their training began. Finally, after 10 days of relentless beatings, Hyun finally began to see a reaction. With a few choice words, Sun began to fight back, and now there was enough power in his strikes. In just a few days, he learned how to fill his sword with anger. The young man was happy for his master's student. He saw with his own eyes that only by pushing a person to their limits could rapid progress be achieved. With that, the training in infusing anger could be completed. It was time to learn how to extract it. Hyun threw down his stick and used his knee for the next strike, which hit the target precisely, and Sun flew up from the blow. Surprisingly, the boy did not lose consciousness. A spark of strength appeared in his eyes, and he was able to attack his uncle. Landing and breathing heavily after the fight, the young man thought he had hit his mark this time. But that was not the case because he saw a cloud of ash appear before his eyes and realized that Hyun was standing behind him, even swinging for the next blow. Quite unexpectedly, the boy did not hit his nephew, but, with a smile, dusted his hands off and suggested they take a walk outside the gate because training was over. Turning to face his uncle, the young man asked where he was going. Hyun looked at him with an eerie smile and asked if his nephew had decided to interrupt him. The young man jumped up and immediately asked where to take the young master. The boy smiled at the fact that Sun was quick to grasp things. In a crowded city, a beggar was sitting and people were throwing various copper coins at him, when suddenly someone threw a silver coin. The man was very grateful to the stranger, who asked for nothing but a casual conversation. The stranger said that it was his first time in Hefei and he had no friends there, so he asked the beggar if there was anyone in Commander Namgun's family named Jin Weigen. They communicated by encoding questions and answers in words between the lines. The beggar replied that there was no one with that name. The man began to tell how he had crossed the Yangtze to get to Hefei, had been attacked by pirates, and had barely survived, and that there was one person who coincidentally matched his description. He was referring to Yu Hyun, the only son of Yu Seong-hwan, who was currently staying with the Namgung family. The man asked for advice on what to do and whether to ask the head for help. But there was no need for that. The beggar said that they would check everything themselves because Hyun and Sun had just passed by them. It had not been confirmed that Yu Hyun was Jin Wigan, so it was too early to bother the head, but he assigned his man to watch the boy anyway. That concluded the conversation. The man stood up and said that he felt relieved after telling about the pirates and thanked the beggar. The beggar laughed and said he was always happy to help, then signaled that it was time to go. Two beggars in rags noticed the man in the hat who was clearly not one of their own. He had been hanging around the Namgung family for a long time and had not paid tribute to the Beggars League. So a proposal was made to beat up the man who was taking away their business, and they decided to bring in more people for this. Meanwhile, the relatives reached the bookstore. Sun didn't understand why Hyun needed so many books with poignant stories. His uncle said that his nephew was a bastard born into a good family who had never known the pain and grief of his relatives. So this was the only way for him to learn about sorrow. Sun looked at him with an expressionless face because his majestic young philosophy teacher was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, more so than him, and did not grieve much either. Suddenly, the boy changed the subject and suggested going to the Peking Opera, which was painfully funny. Namgung's son liked this better than being beaten with sticks and carrying books for his uncle. Joy brings peace to the soul and prevents anger or sadness from overwhelming it. Sun asked if this peace could bring clarity. Hyun said that only with peace of mind can one broaden one's horizons and then better see the enemy's movements. His nephew promised to remember this, but still asked his uncle how he knew all this. Just then, the relatives were followed by a group of people who were looking for the ginseng thief. There were several people, and their plan was to follow the young masters. Yu Hyun took on the role of the beggar and ordered everyone else hiding in the wheat field to carefully capture Namgun and not reveal themselves until they left Hefei. But suddenly, someone intervened, addressing the beggar, and at the same time attracting the attention of the young men. It was a group of beggars who had come to demand that the man pay for the place he had been occupying for some time. The man immediately canceled the operation and began negotiations with the group of people, asking who they were. The group laughed at his ignorance, informing him that they were the Gyuhua gang from Hefei and that the gang's leader, Wang Thol, was with them. Pretending to be innocent and defenseless, the man asked why they were doing this, but no one listened to him and they surrounded him and tried to grab him. The man was nervous. He could not use his inner energy because then the Namgun heirs would have exposed him, so he had to let them beat him. Since this happened in front of Sun, he asked his uncle if they should stop them. The young man had been taught that it was despicable to attack one person with a group. Hyun looked away and said that the boy had grown up in wealth and did not know life outside the gates. Justice does not always prevail in the world, and this was not something they should interfere with. Hefei is under the control of the Namgun family, and it is impossible to get involved in an illegal group, so it is natural that the gang of beggars and vagrants will continue to divide the city for a few more days. Sun asked if that meant they were from Keben, but it didn't look like Keben. The young man recognized Gyuhua's gang, even though it was part of Keben and in fact had nothing to do with it. Simply put, this was not a fight between members of Murimu, but a psychological duel between two gangs of Hefei, so it was not worth paying attention to. The subordinates informed their commander when Hyun and Sun left, and then the man was able to stop the fight. He threw one of the attackers aside, and the others froze in place. The man signaled his men not to interfere. Wang Thol stood behind like a coward but yelled at his subordinates not to stop and to continue. A man approached him with an angry aura and asked if he even realized what he had done. Thol was immediately frightened and did not understand at all if this man had just been beaten. The beggar said something about a 1 in a million chance and a plan that could not afford even the slightest mistake. Thol instantly fell to his knees and began to beg for forgiveness. The only just way to punish the men for their actions was execution. In front of the whole gang, the man's head was twisted off. The man ordered his subordinates to destroy all traces of the crime, and the job was done in an instant. However, one of the bandits managed to escape. He was so traumatized by what he had experienced that he was crying and rocking back and forth. He understood very well that these people were not beggars, and in a state of total hysteria, he ran across the field because he had to inform the Keben branch as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Chang Sun was going crazy at his estate, tearing up a letter from his granddaughter saying that she would not be coming. Hansu calmly informed his father that he had said she could not marry against her will, but the old man could not calm down and ordered a heavenly squad to be sent after his granddaughter and bring her back immediately. The man sighed heavily and explained to his father that the girl was already at the scene of the battle between the groups. She had arranged for the letter to arrive after her departure. Chang Sun was shaking with rage at his granddaughter. The man overturned the table and began to yell at his son, asking how he had raised his children. Hongsu was embarrassed because he remembered that his father himself had decided to raise his granddaughter to be a warrior who would represent the Namgun family. Suddenly, the grandfather changed his anger to mercy and thought that if nothing could be done, then Hyun should be sent to the Cheongmu Alliance. The man immediately went to the boy with his brilliant plan and heard swearing from his gate. Thinking it might be an attack, he jumped over the 3-meter wall with one easy movement. To his great surprise, he saw the boy's training. Hyun taught Sun to put not only anger but also sadness into his work. The boy reminded him of the feelings he had when the main character died in the last novel he read. The old man watched this and couldn't believe that his grandson was being beaten. Hyun had obviously hit a sore spot, and Sun began to swing the stick with tears in his eyes. But it wasn't just tears. He was sobbing, and his next blow was filled with restrained anger. At that moment, Hyun noticed the old man on the fence and, not understanding what he was doing there, immediately ordered the fight to stop. The boy was upset because he had just started to do well and lost the opportunity to properly beat his annoying relative over the head. The old man was surprised that his grandson was swearing, but it did not irritate his noble soul. On the contrary, he could barely contain his laughter. When Hyun asked him what he was doing there, climbing down to the ground, he said that their training seemed so interesting to him, and he somehow got lost in thought when the young man said that the man could just come in and watch. The old man had miscalculated his explanation a little, because it was his house after all. The uncle asked if it seemed to him that his nephew was teaching Sun sword fighting. The young man denied it, saying that it was not possible and that they were just sparring. Sun turned to the young man in surprise because he had indeed been teaching him the art of the sword, so he didn't understand why he would hide it. Chang Sun said that his grandson's style was now very different from that of the Namgun family, which was impossible if no one had taught him. Hyun easily replied that it was Hyun's suggestion. The young man became even more confused and quietly asked his uncle what it all meant. His uncle advised him to remain silent and began to explain the details of a technique called the 7 senses of the sword. The young man recalled that Sun had once said that he had made a breakthrough and found a way to put feelings into the sword. Sun stood silently behind him because now he understood nothing at all. The old man laughed a little when he heard the answer. The story about feelings comforted him. Namgun's sword, which had rejected joy and change, began to change as it entered a new age. Hyun returned to the topic of why Chang Sun had visited them. The old man lit up and began to talk about the Cheonmu alliance. But he was interrupted by an agitated servant who ran into the palace shouting for the heir. Seeing the former head, the man apologized for interrupting the conversation, but emphasized that the matter was urgent because a person from the Hefei branch of Kebon had just arrived. When the old man asked in surprise why they had decided to pay such a visit, the servant replied that a disaster had occurred at Kebon during the night. Both representatives of the Namgun family told Hyun that they would talk to him later because it was time for them to leave. The young man was surprised at how similar the grandson and grandfather looked, even when they were just standing there, both dark-haired and with amber eyes. Since the training was cancelled, the young man did not know what to do and decided to take a walk. In the crowd, Hyun was immediately spotted by those searching for the ginseng thief, and they consulted with their leader using a secret code about what to do. The commander decided that it was unknown when they would have another good chance, so it was better to act now. The order was given to surround the boy and take him out of Hefei as soon as he was alone. But Hyun was in no hurry to be alone. He slowly walked through the streets, where he was invited to every stall, and enjoyed the leisurely moments. Walking through the market in Anping was a little stressful for the boy because everyone was trying to give him things. Here, no one knew him, but he still missed his people and wondered how they were doing and if everything was okay with them. The young man had something to do before returning to Anping so that everyone could continue to live peacefully as they did now. While thinking about what he needed to do before catching the accomplice of chaos, the young man noticed a passerby looking at him. Hyun immediately turned around to get a better look because the face seemed familiar to him. But the man walked past and the young man thought that he had probably just passed him somewhere along the way. His thoughts turned to visiting a bookstore when suddenly someone handed him a treat and asked him to try it. The young man calmly chewed the food offered to him and noticed that the familiar man was watching him. Passing by another bench from which Hyun was being watched, he finally remembered the man. It was the beggar who had been beaten yesterday, but he still recognized him in his decent clothes. In an instant, he remembered the servant who had reported the nighttime incident in Kaban and, putting 2 and 2 together, realized that it was their doing. Suddenly, the young man approached the man pretending to read a book with a smile and, greeting him as if he were an old acquaintance, immediately struck him. None of the pursuers expected this, so the young man took advantage of the opportunity and fled. The men immediately chased after him, but when they ran to where the young man was supposed to be, they came to a dead end. Suddenly, Hyun, who was sitting on the roof of the building, addressed them and asked the pursuers who they were. Laughing, he said he was curious why a crowd of men was chasing him. Joking, he asked if they liked him. A malicious spark flew between the boy and the men, and the young man climbed down from the roof and asked why they were following him like rats. Looking at the man whose face was not very friendly, he assumed that he was yesterday's target. Receiving no response, he realized that his assumption was correct and asked why they were after him. In his mind, Hyun was still trying to determine whether they were the remnants of the 9 dragons or ginseng seekers. But as for the latter, they had strayed too far. Communicating in a secret code, the men began to discuss what to do. Destroying him would be the easiest solution. But he was the son of the previous heir, so they could have serious problems with the authorities. First, they had to verify their assumptions, so they asked him directly if he was Jin Wigan, who had taken the pure ginseng. Here, Hyun began to do what he does best and pretended to be a fool who was hearing this name for the first time. The man looked at this boy skeptically. It was pointless to take his word for it. But there was another reason. To obtain the pure ginseng, one had to reach the level of chi release and above, and the young man did not seem to have anything like that. Inside, Hyun was gloating because his body had been trained by Master Kabanu himself, so he would not let himself be broken so easily. And besides, they would definitely not be able to sense his spiritual energy. If the men had come all this way for ginseng, then they must have been somehow connected to the Servant of Chaos. Hyun decided not to bother and to catch them and shake all the information out of them. Taking into account of the fact that the young man would not be able to obtain ginseng with his skills, the men hastened to apologize and take their leave. But this time, the young man couldn't let them do that, so he approached them and said that they couldn't just take it and leave because he was curious. The gang leader did not try to be polite for a moment and immediately gave the order to knock the boy down. Hyun smiled at this bold act, but they did not kill him immediately, only ordering them to knock him down. But the men who rushed to carry out the order were repelled without even touching the boy. With a smile, crossing his arms over his chest, the boy sarcastically suggested that he looked weak in the eyes of his attackers. The gang leader was amazed at how the boy could do such a thing without a shred of inner strength, and the young man read this well from his expression. Hyun still smiled calmly and asked the men what they were going to do now, and if they could just leave. If they attacked together, it would be inconvenient for him, but he decided that it would not be difficult because he would simply change the situation. Looking at the 2 he had knocked out, the young man asked if the men wanted to hang out with him, and throwing them over his shoulders, he ran off at the speed of light. His pursuers were fast, and one of the men almost caught up with the boy and swung his sword, but the young man dodged it. Looking around, Hyun noticed a building that was just right for his plan. The next moment, he threw the unconscious man onto the roof of the building as if he were a light ball. Everyone nearby began to scatter and shout that the house was about to collapse. But the destruction caused by the thrown man was not enough for the boy, so he decided to finally destroy the building with one well-aimed kick. Dust from the ruins of the destroyed building covered the young man, but he still addressed his pursuers, saying that they were faster than he had expected. However, he still had a plan, and cupping his hands around his mouth, he let out a loud whistle. The man couldn't believe his eyes. Everything had turned out so unexpectedly that a drop of sweat appeared on his face from nervousness. Hyun smiled and called him a naive fool who had been following him all the way from Hephis. He asked if the man wanted to have some more fun with him because very soon he would meet not only him, but also Namgun and Keban. The man glared at him fiercely and called him despicable because he understood that if he got involved with Namgun and Keban, it would be difficult to escape. He and his accomplices drew their swords because they had to escape from there as quickly as possible. Seeing the attackers rushing towards him, the young man smiled at their naive plans to destroy him so that he would not reveal anything. The young man kicked a piece of debris from the building, and the men rushing to attack shouted that he couldn't hide behind it. But the boy had no intention of hiding. He just hinted to them that when they were ordered to run, they had to run. So they were very lucky to experience 12 chain cuts from the Tan family. Suddenly, a voice behind the young man told him to come to his senses because he had exposed his back. It was the man who had attacked him with a sword. Hyun praised their teamwork, but grabbed the man by the throat and said that he would not be a martial arts master if he let his holes be used so easily. Realizing that this was the end, the man instantly swallowed a pill and gave up his soul to God right in the boy's arms. The young man couldn't believe his eyes, but when he turned around, he saw the leader of their group. He impaled the man whom the young man had killed first and was about to interrogate. The man killed all his subordinates so as not to leave any traces. After that, he gave the order to retreat to those who remained, so all 3 began to flee. Hyun was irritated by this and, throwing the body of the man who had poisoned himself in front of him, declared that now he would not hold back either. He quickly caught up with the fugitives, and one of them stopped for a moment to protect his head. But his pathetic sword was no match for Hyun. The boy no longer cared if the others died. He needed the leader. Suddenly, Upon reaching the main road, the men split up, creating unnecessary problems for the young man. He needed the leader, but if the other one got away, it would cause unwanted trouble. But Hyun was not alone. The men had been warned that someone was waiting for them ahead. On the roof of the building stood a heavenly squad and representatives of Kabanu. The young man smiled because now he could focus on catching the leader. But despite this, he did not miss the opportunity to complain that help had arrived rather slowly. The man could not allow himself to be captured because otherwise their grand plans would come to an end. He took a red ball out of his pocket, threw it back, creating an explosion, and in a split second, when it was impossible to turn back, he realized that the young man was no longer behind him. At that moment, the man was punched in the face by the young man who had told his uncle to look at him. Warming up his arms, Hyun suggested that the man accept defeat because all his subordinates had already been caught. The beaten man angrily asked who the boy was and whether he had been hiding his strength from the Yu family. But the young man, with his childish game, said that this would not work because the winner should ask the first question. He asked the man who he was, but received only silence in response. The boy smiled because he was in no hurry since they were alone and had plenty of time. But the man got up and took his sword. He knew that all his subordinates understood that there was no way out of the situation and that they had to take their own lives, and he would be no exception. But despite the fact that he was doomed to die, he decided to take this creature with him. Hyun was very familiar with this look. He knew that his uncle was planning to do something before passing away. The young man's reaction outraged the man. It seemed to him that the whole situation was a joke to him. But the young man was serious. He saw neither Namgun nor Kaban nearby, so he decided to finish off the man with one blow. His uncle's audacity enraged him, and he decided to slit the boy's throat to finally silence him. The man assumed that the boy would instantly close the distance and strike. Then he would have a chance to stab him in the throat. He waited impatiently for the boy to attack. But the man miscalculated badly. Hyun was going to show him one last time what it meant to be on another level. A carefree force touched the surface of the earth, causing it to vibrate slightly. The leg that took the step felt a hardness capable of supporting the heavens. The man saw the young man raise his fist and thought he wanted to intimidate him, and at that moment he received a blow to the solar plexus. Hyun smiled, asking the man how he knew this technique, which was a forgotten art of Shaolin, the 100-step fist technique. The boy had to be punched in the face hundreds of thousands of times to master it. Looking at the man who was already coughing up blood, the young man wondered what to do with him. He couldn't interrogate him on the spot, so he decided to take him to the Namgung family. Suddenly, a hairy man interrupted him and asked him to stop. He introduced himself as the head of the Kaban branch in Hefei, Paeksan, and asked permission to take a quick look at the man. The young man did not object, and then two others who were with Paeksan approached and took a closer look at the attacker. After taking a closer look, they turned to the head and said that the man resembled the thief described by Baum. Paeksan respectfully asked the young warrior to hand the scoundrel over to Kevin. The young man grimaced as he looked at them. How cleverly this gang had gathered to lure his prey away from him. At that moment, Namgun's son's cry was heard as he ran to his uncle and asked who had done this to his clothes because the boy was quite torn. In a fit of rage, he even asked who was tired of living here, because in 10 days of intense training with Hyun, he had learned the lesson of a faithful dog. But suddenly, Hyun gave him a delicious slap on the back of the head and called him a bastard. Looking up, Sun asked why he was being punished and almost got another beating. At that moment, Paek-san took a closer look at the robber's body. He didn't look weak. Even his subordinates had reached the level of chi release and chi shot. Looking at Hyun, he couldn't believe that he had dealt with them alone. Seeing that the young man was unhappy with such scrutiny, the man immediately apologized for his rudeness. The young man quickly changed the subject and asked what this man had done if he was recognized in Kabani. He was told that the Gyuhua gang had been completely wiped out by this scoundrel. The young man was asked a counter question about what he had done to attract the interest of these men. Yun said that they were chasing someone and mistook him for that person. They immediately asked him who they mistook him for, and the young man replied that he no longer knew. He was a student of the great Chui Bul, who ruled over Kiben and would not allow himself to be pushed around. Peck looked at the young man suspiciously because he felt that he was definitely hiding something. Yun had his advantages from the fact that the strangers had come here looking for him. If he had brought him to the Namgun family on his own and tried to break him, his current forces would not have been enough. Besides, those scumbags were hiding and operating in the shadows, and there was no telling what they might do once they found out he was after them. And if they found out that the surveillance team had been compromised, they would start to press even harder. And worse, the Yu family could suffer. The young man could not allow that to happen. So he decided to divert their attention, especially now that he knew that the servant was not alone and also had power. Kiban was the best choice for this. If the beggars were determined to get to the bottom of things, they would surely discover the plans of Chaos's follower and confront him. This way, he could buy himself some time. He just needed to give them a push, so he casually mentioned that someone more powerful was behind this scoundrel. Something said about the upside-down sky, and Paek-sun instantly boiled over with the desire to get the scoundrel as a test subject, so he began to beg the young master even more. Hyun began to play a drama, pretending that he understood everything perfectly, but he himself nearly died and showed his scratch, pretending that it was a serious wound. Then he glanced at his nephew, hinting that he should play along. Sun panicked. He didn't understand his uncle's hints, so he didn't know what to do and began to assume that the boy was in pain. The young man concentrated harder to figure out what his uncle wanted from him, and racking his brains began to remember that he had been taught not only martial arts, but also how to conduct state affairs and arithmetic. Having come to some conclusions, he shouted at the men to stop and not put his uncle in an awkward position. The young man thought he had settled everything, but Hyun still looked at him with dissatisfaction. Paek-san began to plead even more earnestly, saying that Kabane's honor was at stake. Namgun-sun began to say that he had already been given a clear answer, and there was no need to beg. But his uncle interrupted him and said that if such distinguished gentlemen asked him to, he would help them. He only set two conditions: not to spread the word that he was involved, and to inform him immediately if they found out anything about their identities. The young man happily handed the scoundrels over to Kabane if he promised to fulfill these conditions, and the man, moderately pleased with the agreement, swore by his name to fulfill his promise. The parties agreed on everything and parted ways. Hyun walked home with a smile from ear to ear. The beggars felt as if they had been cheated, especially since they had to investigate the case for free. But the head of Paek-sun scolded his foolish subordinate because he did not understand at all that the case was about a coup that was encoded in the phrase, "turn the sky upside down." This meant that there were those who wanted to seize Murim. The young men, unlike the experienced head, were shocked. Looking at his prey, the man said that if they managed to get the truth out of him that someone had their eye on Murim, it would be a direct path to the elder's place in the main residence. Paek-sun's subordinates lifted the scoundrel up and carried him in the direction of their boss. When night fell, Hyun did not sleep. He thought about what was to come. After all, his actions had changed the course of history. Looking out the open window, he remembered that in 6 months, the servant was supposed to receive a tip about the second treasure from Hwang Do-sum, who was sitting in the Cheonmu prison. But after the boy took the ginseng, history changed. And most importantly, if his enemy had power, he would have to be even more careful than he was now. The young man assumed that if the man was unable to obtain the ginseng, he would act twice as fast to get the second treasure. Then Hyun had an even more difficult task: to find Hwang Do-sum even earlier and act even faster to stop the chaos. The young man decided that he needed to go to the Cheonmu Alliance and inform the former head of the Namgung family about this. The old man almost jumped out of his pants with joy. The young man insisted that he wanted to meet other people and gain experience, but Changseon didn't need that and would gladly give Hyun a letter of recommendation without it. He also planned to write to his granddaughter, Hee, asking her to help the young man, and then they would get closer and have a wedding. Of course, this was not what the young man wanted, but it didn't matter, as long as they let him go. Hyun had one more request. He wanted Sun to go with him because he could use the help. Judging by the reaction of the young man sitting next to him, he had not been warned about these plans. The situation was more complicated here because the young man had certain responsibilities as the heir to the clan. Surprisingly, Hyun did not object, saying that the heir indeed had a great responsibility to inherit the future family and that he had no choice. The young man calmly stood up and politely said that he had to go and discuss all the details with the head. Sun looked at his uncle in surprise because he knew that he would not give up his whims so easily. And he was right because the young man casually mentioned that, besides he, there were others in the Murimu Alliance, the 5 homes, as the 5 beauties of the righteous sex of the new stars of Murimu were called. Smiling slyly, he continued to talk as if he had accidentally mentioned it to Chang-sun, who listened 1,000 times more attentively than he had heard about the beauty of the girls, and could not wait to meet them. The young man knew where to strike and touched on the very desire of the old man to marry his granddaughter to him. But to finally achieve the desired effect, he decided to throw in a couple more phrases at the exit. As if fate were unpredictable, he might become close to someone, and then a wedding would not be far off, followed by children and so on. After all, spring was just around the corner and the weather was warm. This was decisive in the man's decision. He shouted that a family council must be convened immediately. Hyun heard this and was already walking to the room, jumping happily, rejoicing in his own victory. Meanwhile, a ship with officials arrived in Yangtze. A stern man in expensive clothes ordered them to keep a closer eye on their belongings. A ship employee handed something to the lord and he began to politely refuse, saying that it was not necessary, but the employee insisted, saying that they were not strangers. Suddenly, another official arrived and told his companions to wrap up and go to breakfast. Three men dressed in black and gold robes descended from the ship while everyone wished them a safe journey. But at first glance, the polite employees sincerely hated these officials, who knew nothing but how to throw money around. After the ship set sail, the man went down into the hold and, coughing, called someone, saying that he had ordered the sailors not to come down there until they arrived in Wuhan. A man dressed in expensive clothes came out from behind the boxes and smiled. He promised the sailor that he would pay the rest as soon as they docked. It couldn't be any other way. The hardest thing left for them was to survive an encounter with the black whale pirates. The man looked at the ship from which another group of people was transferring to them and thought that there should be no problems with the payment for the pass. With a loud shout at his uncle, Sun stepped onto the deck. He forbade him to do something, but the young man only asked why he was so afraid of some pirates. The young man tried to explain to Hyun that even though catching pirates seemed like a good thing, he had to think about the losses. The boy really didn't know what the situation was here, but he was sure he could defeat everyone. Sun could see from his uncle's face that he had no understanding of the situation, so he explained that if they provoked the Yangtze pirates, they would be in big trouble. There was a possibility that confronting the pirates could provoke a battle with the Yangtze River Gang. Hyun looked at his nephew with a bored expression and wondered if he had always been so fond of talking. If a single battle with a band of pirates didn't scare him, the boy moved on to heavy artillery and told him about the monster his grandfather had been fighting for a long time. The water tamer king Gu Saji was a man who was called the Monster of the Sea. Hyun was not impressed, so he simply asked him to sit down and not get involved, because if a battle with the pirates broke out, all the crossings on the Yangtze River would burn down, leading to enormous losses. The boy looked at his annoying nephew and slapped him on the back of the head. With tears in his eyes, he asked why his uncle was always drinking, as it was already becoming a bad habit. But Hyun did not listen to his whining. He thought about the fact that he had never heard of the king who tamed the waters, but this time he decided not to get involved, just to be on the safe side. Seagulls flew peacefully over the sea. A sailor stood on the deck and looked into the distance, and when he saw the black whale pirate ship, he shouted to alert everyone. Hearing the commotion on the deck, all the other people on the ship came out to see what was happening. As soon as the pirate stepped onto the deck, the ship's captain immediately ran up to him and began asking the owner of the pier, Kudok, how he was doing. The man was also glad to see him and asked how he was doing in return. The ship's captain laughed and said that thanks to Kudok, everything was fine, and asked the sailor to bring a chest with gold. The pier owner was satisfied. He didn't even have to say anything. Everything was done without unnecessary hints. Sun saw that the deal had gone well, but he didn't understand why the pirates weren't leaving. Hyun, who was standing nearby, said, "Why worry about all sorts of trifles when there was such a beautiful sea all around?" The pirate said that with the pass, the matter was settled, but he had one more order to find one person. The man became visibly nervous when Kudok asked if everyone had come up on deck, or if the man was hiding someone. The pirate put his hand on his shoulder and said that he knew him well and that he sometimes gave rides to violators. The pirate promised to turn a blind eye to the illegal immigrant if he was not the one they were looking for and hinted that there was no need to betray each other. The nervous sailor remembered that he would be paid later, but he wanted to live even more. Extremely nervous, he nevertheless said that one person was hiding in the hold, and Kudok ordered Mucha to go with the ship's owner to check. The pirate loudly announced that they were looking for someone and asked everyone to cooperate and line up in a row. They would only find the criminal, and the others were in no danger. Hearing this, the people who were just traveling on the ship became even more frightened. One of the pirates went to check the ranks and saw Hyun, who had his back turned and was calmly admiring the sea. The man came closer and slapped the boy on the back of the head, asking if he was deaf because everyone had been told to line up. Sun, who was standing nearby, looked at the man and begged him and all the gods to let the young man be patient with this ignorant man. Fortunately for his nephew, the young man did not have time to do anything, because there was a commotion in the hold, and soon a man came out confidently. Kudok was angry because the man did not want to come out peacefully and instead beat up his men. The criminal was surprised that Keban had gone to such lengths to find him. However, he was disappointed that such a mission had been entrusted to some worthless pirates. Oh, how those words angered Doc. The man instantly exploded, grabbing his sword. He didn't care that the goods were requested alive. His thirst for revenge for the insult was stronger. Yun had already decided to rate the pirate as quite skilled, but he noticed that the man had quite skillfully dodged the blow. Unexpectedly for everyone, the young man snatched the sword from the pirate who had just struck him and, shouting threats, jumped at the criminal. Sun immediately wanted to stop his uncle, but the young man stopped himself and looked closely at the stranger's hand. When the pirate damaged the man's clothes, a tattoo of a red snake became visible on his arm. In the prison of the Cheonmu Union, there was a man with such a tattoo. His name was Hwang Dok-sam, and he knew where the treasure Hyun was looking for was located. The young man smiled, deciding that this time heaven was on his side. Sun shouted and asked his uncle not to interfere because he had promised him not to get into danger. Hyun had no intention of listening to his nephew and ordered him to protect the people, saying that if anyone got hurt, he would have to train his anger for 2 days. The young man immediately drew his sword and prepared to carry out his uncle's order, but he was sure that he would not be able to stop everyone on his own. The only way he could see was to increase the speed of his sword, and the sum made it light, so he had to invest in it. The young man created streams of energy that protected people by quickly swinging his sword, and everyone behind him was sincerely grateful to him. Sun did not distract himself from his work and watched closely what his uncle was going to do. Kudok swung his sword, and Hwang Dok-san tried to dodge, seeing that the man was putting too much force into his blow. Because of this, his heavy sword was slightly off balance, and the man decided to take advantage of this and strike his blow. It was his only chance to win. But suddenly, out of nowhere, Hyun appeared between the men, stood up to defend Hwang, and punched the pirate in the face. After the man fell to the floor, Dokun asked the young man why he was defending him. The young man asked the man if he was Hwan Do-sun, and seeing the surprised look on his face, realized he had made a mistake. He said he would save the man because he had some interesting questions for him. Hyun, in his usual relaxed manner, told the pirates that he needed this man and asked them what they would do. Would they just leave, or would he have to kill them all? The pirates froze in place, and the young man thought they had not understood his proposal and yelled at them. However, when he turned around, he saw that Hwang Jok-san had vanished. The young man ran to the forest and saw that the man had jumped into the water and was running away like crazy. Hyun did not understand such behavior at all because he had saved him with such difficulty, and now he was running away instead of saying thank you. Kudok, who had regained consciousness, got up a little and ordered his subordinates to catch the man. His loyal pirates immediately obeyed their boss and rushed to jump into the water. Without turning around, the young man called his nephew, who immediately responded. The uncle gave Sun the task of dealing with Kudok and announced a terrible punishment if he failed, and the man escaped. As punishment, the boy faced a week of anger training, and Hyun loved to train his anger by beating his nephew unconscious. After terrifying the young man, Hyun heard Sun's solemn vow that he would lie there with his bones, but would not let the pirate escape. Now the young man could dive after Hwang Dok-san with peace of mind. As soon as he touched the water, the young man swam quickly like a fish. Kudok was shocked by this turn of events, and Sun asked him who this man was that they were chasing after. On top of everything else, the nephew was simply amazed by his uncle and wondered when he had learned the martial arts of water. He had heard that the boy swam a lot when he was trying to lose weight and thought that he might have learned something then. Suddenly, the pirate asked the young man who he was and made a big mistake because he reminded him that he had a mission to destroy Kudok. The man immediately began to ask if he even knew who he was, and to Sun, he was nothing more than an evil pirate who had almost sent ordinary people to their deaths. He wasn't going to talk to him for long and proceeded to give a direct order and simply began to beat the man. At that time, Hyun was swimming fast and was already catching up with the first pirates, shouting Mr. Hwan's name. One of the naive men decided that he could use his sword against the boy in the water. The young man dodged, then suddenly surfaced, pushed off the pirate's head, and rose up. The young man really enjoyed such games, so he decided to continue in this manner. He remembered that if Botkid could cross the huge Hwanghae River on a single reed leaf, then he could cross the Yangtze River on the pirates' heads. In a moment, Hyun saw the fugitive and, turning to him, solemnly advised him to stop. Doksun was shocked that the young man had instantly crossed the crowd of pirates. He assumed that the boy was a great master who used flight over water when a person glides over water as if it were flat ground. Hyun reassured him and said that he did not know such a technique, but simply possessed perfect martial arts skills. And even so, the man was not going to give up so easily. The young man clicked his tongue in dissatisfaction, seeing no reason to complicate things. Dodging Hwan's futile attempt to strike, the young man grabbed him by the collar and threw him to the ground. After landing, Hyun said that this was precisely why it was not worth wasting energy, as he would have saved the man anyway if he had answered his question. Doksun crawled away from the young man and shouted, asking why he should believe someone like him. This offended the young man, as the man had not even introduced himself yet and was already insulting him. With one blow, he pressed a point on the man's chest and advised him not to run away, but to wait until the young man dealt with those who were interfering with him, and then they would talk. The man began to shout, asking who the young man was, but Hyun pressed a few more points on his shoulders. As long as his will was suppressed, he would remain alive. The young man tried to explain everything correctly. He did not want to hurt the man. He was just afraid that he would run away again. At that moment, the pirates climbed out of the water. The young man looked at them and began to think about how best to deal with them. As a crowd rushed towards him, wanting to capture him, the young man decided that the techniques of the Tang family would be most suitable. Hyun said that he initially had a calm disposition, but as his strict teacher An Chang-soo said, everything that exists can become a hidden weapon. When you reach a certain level, you can use not only gravel but also sand as a weapon. In the Nine Dragons Fortress, the young man used snow, but now all he needed were pebbles, which he threw at his attackers with tremendous speed. The stones hit their targets accurately, and the first 4 people who were running ahead fell to the ground. Those who remained stood in fear, and Hyun thought aloud about his nephew's words that this could indeed lead to a serious conflict in which people could suffer, which did not suit him. He smiled like a madman and said that in that case it would be best to get rid of the witnesses. The pirates rushed to flee one after the other, but they could not escape Hyun's sword. He dealt with the pirates, so now it was time to talk to the man. The young man approached him and unlocked the previously blocked points. As soon as Hwang Do-kung was able to speak, the first question was who the young man was. The young man introduced himself by his old name, Jin Weigen. Hyun wasn't sure if the man was connected to the Servant of Chaos, so he didn't risk revealing his true identity. The young man began to think about how best to extract information from this suspicious man, so he decided to scare him a little by saying that he had only one question and that he should think carefully about his answer. In the end, the young man simply asked where the 1,000-year-old shell was. Hwang Do-san was shocked when he heard this question. Hyun was delighted that the man knew about this creature and eagerly asked where it was located. Hwang Do-kwan nervously pressed his lips together and stammered that he did not know. The young man pretended to accept his answer and, standing up, said that in that case he would check it out. He began to kick the man, saying some kind words wishing him sweet dreams if he managed to tell the truth before they buried him alive. The man said that this would not happen in the front yard or in the mountains behind the house. The man did not understand anything and only thought that he had encountered a madman. Meanwhile, Sun had already swum to the shore and was wondering why his uncle had swum so far, and when he saw him beating someone, he was shocked that the man was being beaten even harder than him. He understood that in such moments it was better to stay away from his uncle, so he shouted to Kudok, who was rowing the boat with an oar. He told him not to rush. The man thought Sun was an inconsistent jerk because just a minute ago he was urging him on. But the pirate had no other choice but to endure a little longer, because when the bosses showed up, these two would go to hell. Hyun beat Hwang Do-san so badly that he passed out for 4 hours and only came to on the boat, where he immediately saw the boy's sly smile. Since he still hadn't heard the answer he wanted, he decided to start his torture again. But his work was interrupted by a pirate who shouted joyfully about someone's arrival. The man was sure that now the boys were doomed. After all, they had been found by the flagship of the Black Whale Pirates, a giant ship with black sails. Kudok began to threaten the young men that now they were definitely doomed, but not for long, because he got a good beating from Hyun. The young man smiled and told his nephew that they seemed to have guests. But Sonu was not in the mood to laugh. He reminded his uncle that he had asked him to be careful, but his uncle just shrugged and said that nothing could be done now. Jumping onto the ship with a wild smile, he urged his nephew to deal with everything quickly and return to the ship. The boys quickly dealt with the ship, and the pirates were already clinging to its wreckage in the water. Kudok shut up, and without expecting to be rescued, rode silently under Hyun's dissatisfied gaze. The chief was shocked when he saw his pirate friend rowing in favor of those bandits. Suddenly, one of his subordinates swam up to his board and asked if there was a red dry signal flare left. The pirate noted that, in that case, their boss would find out that they had taken the assignment without his permission. But the man didn't care if they heard a few bad words addressed to them, as long as they preserved the honor of the Black Whales. When the shell rose, the same man who had subjugated all the pirates and kept even the warriors of the combat world in fear would arrive. The great advisor of the Chongmu Chagal Union, Subom, was informed about the red projectile that flew over the Yangtze. The man reacted very violently and negatively. The projectile was launched 2 hours ago in the Yangtze River area, where a group of pirates gathered at the mouth of the river demanding that the Yangtze checkpoint be opened. Everyone in the room knew that the red shell was a pirate signal used only in case of serious threat. Subom asked about the reason for this event, but he was told that they did not know yet. The man was not satisfied with this answer and shouted that 2 hours had already passed and they still had not managed to find out the reason for the launch of the red signal. The advisor slammed his fist on the table and said that if the enemy was so important that the pirates had used such a signal, then they had to get it because the enemy of their enemy was their ally. The man ordered that a message be sent to the head of the Green Dragons to immediately go to the western checkpoint of Wuhan to suppress the protest. The pirates could not be allowed to gain access to the Wuhan waterway, which included Chongmu. Only now did Subom ask where the shell had been fired from, and he was told that it had happened on the way from Anhui to Hubei. A drop of nervous sweat rolled down the man's forehead because he knew that the black whale pirates who obeyed the water monster, the tamer of water bodies, were operating there. Chagol anxiously asked where he was now, and according to intelligence reports, the man was in the vicinity of Eju. Looking at the location of Ezhou, Yangtze, and Wuhan, it was clear that the tamer was not far from them. After assessing everything, Subin asked which of Keban's guests in the alliance had the highest status. A young wandering dragon had just arrived to take the entrance exam for the Hidden Dragon Squad. The man was very pleased with this information. The younger wandering dragon was calmly drinking in the evening when suddenly he was disturbed and told about the pirate's red signal. The boy's name was K. Dushin. The right side of his face and shoulder had a burn scar, and he complained that people were telling him all sorts of nonsense. His friend got drunk almost to the point of unconsciousness and was lying on the table. The young man tried to lift him up himself, not understanding the point of getting so drunk, as it was harmful to his health. Ki Dushin couldn't take it anymore and yelled at his friend, who raised his head and asked discontentedly why he had been woken up. The young man began to complain that his friend's uncle was sending him on a mission, and that his friend was also going to Shenxi tomorrow, where a battle with gangs had broken out. This meant that they would not be able to see each other for a long time, but the drunkard still did not understand why he had been woken up. Kadushin said bluntly that they were friends and had to say goodbye, but the young man was not in the mood for that. His drink was already coming up, and he had no intention of saying goodbye. The boy collapsed onto the table again and fell asleep instantly, while Dusan looked at his friend with disgust. Afterwards, the young man handed a bundle to his servant and ordered him to find beggars near the crossing and give them the task of searching the waterway north of Wuhan. Meanwhile, the drunkard vomited a little and felt better, so he began to think about the situation and realized that the water tamer could interfere. Despite his previous tactlessness, the young man did not want his vagabond friend to suffer for no reason. Yun and his nephew returned to the deck of their ship, where the passengers, alarmed by the events, were still not in their cabins. Sun helped his uncle fight off the new pirates who had come for their souls. Suddenly, he distracted him from the fight with another enemy and drew his attention to a group of ships approaching. No matter how many ships the boy destroyed, they kept coming and coming. The young man still couldn't interrogate Huang Dosam, so it was too early to give up, and he asked Kudok if there was anything nearby where they could land. But suddenly, a young man of beggarly appearance interfered with the boy's plans, unexpectedly jumping onto the deck. It was the younger wandering dragon Kabana K. Dushin. He announced that from now on, this ship was under the protection of the Cheonmu Alliance and suggested taking the opportunity to retreat. Then he turned to Hyun and said that he could rest easy because he would now be protected. The young man looked closely at the unexpected guest and recognized him as another of his teachers, a scoundrel. The ship stopped anyway. Hyun was surprised that his teacher, nicknamed Chui Bull, had been obeyed. The men folded their arms in greeting and said that the Yangtze River pirates welcomed the chief. Turning his head slightly to the side and seeing the boat with the nobleman, the young man realized that the pirates had stopped for a reason. It was the king who tamed the waters, and he was too close, so everything was not going according to plan. The young man shouted to Ku, who was at the oars, to turn around because they could not face the leaders of the robbers. All the rowers began to rush about, but the turning process was too slow, and at this rate, they would not be able to avoid a confrontation. But the man instantly waved his hand and created an energy so powerful that it stopped the entire ship. Here, Hyun realized that his opponent was extremely strong, and in the meantime, he jumped onto the deck. The tamer himself wore a hat, was not large in stature and quite thin, but the guard with him was a burly, muscular man. Everyone except Hyun began to introduce themselves one by one, and K. Dushin introduced himself as the ambassador of Kabon and greeted the ruler of the Yangtze River. Sun also introduced himself as the son of the Namun family and greeted the conqueror of the waters. Dusin began to say something as the younger son of the head of Keban, but he was interrupted. The head's guard rushed past the stunned Hyun at the speed of light and grabbed the boy by the throat. Looking at the young man who had managed to move out of the man's path, the subduer laughed at the fact that a young man of 20 had caught the movements of Jun-san, who had mastered the shining chi to perfection. Seeing the giant choking Dushin, Hyun quickly turned to the head and began to speak politely. Addressing him as an elder, he asked why a man like him would intimidate a youngster, as if he were very concerned about his reputation. Surprisingly, the man listened to him, called Jun-san back, and agreed that it was not worth tarnishing his reputation. The man immediately let go of the boy, and filled with his powerful energy, the tamer asked the boy to explain what was going on. Hyun was nervous. They had almost arrived at Cheonmu, and this man had ruined all their plans. If the boy didn't speak to him correctly, he would immediately be sent to meet the Apostle Peter. The young man began to make something up on the fly, as if they were just sailing in Wuhan, and then pirates began to intimidate ordinary people. The man added to his story by asking if the young man had decided to show mercy and save the people. Hyun happily agreed. However, seeing the dangerously strong aura of anger, the young man realized that they did not believe him. Only one thought was spinning in his head: what to do. Suddenly, the boy came up with something. Hyun told the elder that he was from the Yu family in Anping County, Henan Province. The man might not have known her because she was in no way connected to Murim, but he emphasized that he had powerful support from the authorities. His father had previously been the crown prince, and even now he was in the capital, looking after the heir at the request of His Majesty the Emperor. His teacher, a divine strategist, said that in order to crush your opponent with words, you must show that you have powerful support, and if you don't, then lie boldly. But this did not work here, as it seemed to only irritate the man, who said that he did not care whose son Hyun was. The boy was nervous again because of his failure, and the stupid instructions of the teachers he trusted as much as himself. The elder said that he was a pirate from birth and would remain one until the end of his days, and that he would be persecuted until the very end, no matter who was in power or what warring clans there were. Hyun was already starting to get angry because of his hopeless situation, as he had to protect Namgung-sun's crew and the scum of a teacher. On top of that, Hwang Do-kama was lying unconscious and tied up somewhere in the hold. The guy had no idea what to do with that level of power. He couldn't even touch the Water King's guard with a finger. Fortunately, the divine strategist had taught him something else. There are two truths in agreement: to pressure your opponent with force or to lure them with something good to arouse their interest. Hyun showed courtesy by clasping his fist to his palm and began a speech asking the elder to understand him correctly and listen to him. The young man wriggled out of it by saying that he was only reporting his status and would not dare to be disrespectful to the elder. The man asked skeptically what the boy was getting at. Hyun politely continued, saying that he would like to be shown mercy and spared, but he understood that this was unlikely since he had sunk dozens of ships. With all due respect, the young man offered compensation that would satisfy the man, thinking that since he was a pirate, he must be greedy for money. After asking about the compensation, the old man asked if the young man was talking about money. Hyun confirmed this and asked the elder how much he wanted as compensation. After a moment's pause, laughter broke out, turning into loud guffaws from the tamer of the waters. Hyun was puzzled by this reaction and thought that the old man had gone mad from thoughts of gold bars because he could not explain it otherwise. Suddenly, the man was right next to the young man and said with a smile that he liked this bastard. The young man was frightened and jumped back to increase the distance between them. The man suggested that the boy look at the rocks where a group of people were standing. They were all people from the Cheonmu clan, all armed with swords and ready for action, yet they all stood still. The old man asked the boy what he thought about why they weren't doing anything. Hyun didn't really understand what was meant by this question. The situation of Cheonmu was obvious. The man simply said that they were trying things out. At first, they shout about their union like righteous people, but in their minds, they decide what will be more beneficial for them. If they resolve the conflict with him for the sake of a handful of young men, the losses would be enormous. They were also representatives of righteous sects, so the man was interested in why Hyun was offering him a deal to save everyone. The young man understood that the old man's lie would not work, but would he believe that he needed these two to save the world? While Hyun was thinking hard, the elder looked at him closely. He guessed the boy's character. However, he could not discern the young man's abilities, even though he understood that a novice would not be able to see Junsan's movements. Unable to figure Hyun out, he decided to test him personally, so he began by saying that not everything in the world can be solved with money. The man ordered his henchmen to attack Kyu Dushin, so Hyun had no choice but to rush to defend the young man. The beggar was so confused that he froze in place, for which he was yelled at by the boy to dodge. While Hyun was worried about his former teacher and future student, he missed a blow from Junsun. The only way out of this situation, the boy saw, was to end it with one precise blow. His opponent was a master who had reached the initial stage of Shining Chi, so a protracted battle would be a sure defeat for the young man, and he had to finish it with one blow. The power was close to its source and filled with the purest natural Chi, which was a level higher in strength and quality than the internal Chi accumulated in Dantian. The young man knew that his opponent would not be able to block or dodge the blow, but suddenly he saw a smile on his opponent's face. Just as unexpectedly, the pirate chief intervened in the fight and struck the boy, preventing him from delivering the final blow. The young man collapsed between the bruiser and the tamer, thinking that they had treated him very unfairly. His eyes closed, and the last thing he saw was the smiling face of the king, the tamer of the waters. Seeing his uncle in such a helpless, unconscious state, Sun grabbed his sword. But the man quickly stopped him, advising the child not to make fatal mistakes. He suppressed the young man with a single glance, and he could not move or fully draw his sword. Watching Hyun throw Sun over his shoulder, Sun was overcome with rage. His uncle had fought for him at the cost of his own life, and he was doing nothing. This could not continue. His nephew was determined to save his uncle. His chi was filled and broke the man's power, so he was able to move and draw his sword. The old man was very interested in such an unexpected turn of events. Sun stood with his sword and thought that he would save his uncle at any cost, even if it cost him his life. The boy awakened the will of the sword, which surprised the old man. Judging by its white color, it was clear that he had not mastered it perfectly, but it was definitely her. The man wondered where such emeralds came from. One repelled Jun's son. The other dispelled his art of binding chi, which immobilized the enemy with energy alone. However, Sun was not in the best condition to fight because the excessive boiling power had penetrated his brain. The old man recognized the young man as a relative of his old friend Chang-san and smiled. It seemed that the boy could no longer hear him because he was rushing at the old man with his sword with all his might. The man could not destroy the boy and prevent his grandfather from seeing what such a talented youngster would grow up to be. So he simply stamped his foot, and his chi stirred the water and the entire ship. When the day came, Hyun gradually began to come to his senses and was awakened by a wonderful aroma. Opening his eyes, he saw Jun-san sitting on the ground and enjoying some roasted meat. The boy did not understand what was happening and stood up abruptly, and the man told him to satisfy his hunger first. Jun-san personally caught and roasted the game. 4 people were sitting on the lawn with Ku Dog, who was adjusting the fire when the elder pointed out that it was going out. The old man handed the boy some meat, saying that his stomach was empty and he should eat something. Suddenly, Hyun remembered his nephew and began to look around, but he did not see Sun or Dushin. He assumed the worst and angrily asked the men what they had done with the other boys. The old man calmed the young man and said that he had spared them and handed them over to the Jongmu Alliance. Hyun did not expect to hear about mercy. The man repeated himself so that the young man would understand that he had not misheard and said that the Namgun family's child was slightly injured but would get better when he came to. He assured Hyun that he should not worry, that he and Changseon were deeply connected by evil fate, but that he would not trample the sprout into the ground. The young man breathed a sigh of relief when he finally heard that his nephew was all right. Suddenly, his stomach growled treacherously, and the man said that he knew he was hungry. Taking a piece of meat in his hands, the young man assumed that it might be poisoned, but the man told him that he was poisoning himself by thinking too much. Hyun took a chance and began to chew the game. Although his face was extremely dissatisfied, he muttered that it was delicious. The old man looked at the young man, smiled, and encouraged him to eat more. At that time, Namgung's son was already being treated by the best acupuncture doctors in the Union. The old doctor sighed with relief and said that the Water King had shown mercy for some reason. Kyu Dushin was surprised by these words. To him, mercy did not mean beating a person to the point of near death. The doctor lamented how the clan chief's disciple could be so foolish. If it weren't for the Water King, Sun would have quickly gone mad and by now would have become disabled. The doctor did not know why the king had done this, but he had not only suppressed the boy's demonic chi, but also disrupted his circulation as a whole. Dushin couldn't understand why the tamer did that. The doctor ordered him to watch over the boy while he went to write a letter to his family. Namgun had to tame the anger of the King of Swords before he fell into misfortune upon hearing the news. Kai Dushin began to remember everything that had happened then, but then everything happened in an instant. Sun, enraged, with fierce eyes, rushed at the old man who simply slammed him to the floor. In an instant, the young man froze as if he had come to his senses, and the man said that was all and ordered everyone to leave. He jumped into the boat on which he had arrived with Hyun and the guard and calmly sailed away. Dushin sat thinking and could not understand what had happened and why the King of the Waters had taken young Lord Yu with him. Meanwhile, Hyun was already sitting by the fire, surrounded by men, and Jun-sung was handing him an extra portion of meat. The man smiled kindly, which surprised the young man because when they were fighting, he had pounced on him like a tiger. Then he looked at the King of the Waters and thought that he looked like an ordinary old man. A picture of how powerful the man had looked the night before popped into his mind, and the young man even wondered if he had some kind of split personality. The old man drank sake and enjoyed it very much, so he offered to pour some for the boy and asked him how old he was. Hyun first drank it in one gulp and then replied that he was 17. The king did not hide his surprise at such young talent at such an age. Now, the boy poured the old man a drink and asked him who his teacher was. The young man thought carefully about why the man was interested in this. Bringing the cup of liquor to his mouth, the man smiled and insisted on an answer. Hyun replied that his teacher was his brother-in-law, who belonged to the Tam family from Hubei. The young man thought it was best not to go into details, but the old man suddenly said that even though it was a region of fighting clans, He was familiar with the art of the Tam family. The martial arts of the Tam family were bold and powerful, not at all as soft and flexible as those of the young man. In addition, the palm technique with which the young man attacked Jun-san differed from the usual technique of internal qigong, which accumulates inside the body. There was something more fundamental here. Hyun was both impressed and nervous. Even the king of the sword did not understand this, but the king of the waters somehow guessed it, and for a young man, he had a rather strange look. Before he was torn apart even more, Hyun decided to ask the man directly if he was interested in something. Of course, the old man was interested in something. He had never seen energy used in this way before. The men sitting on the side were already a little bored and didn't know what to do, whether to continue grilling the meat or not. The old man concluded that the young man did not have a teacher in Murami if his son-in-law had taught him. Hyun confirmed that he could not tell about the 6 saints. Then suddenly, the king of the waters offered him to become his student. The young man was puzzled by such an offer. For him, it was some kind of nonsense. Then the old man reminded him that the young man had promised to pay him for the damage he had caused, so if he became his disciple, the king would turn a blind eye to the incident. Hyun screamed inside. He was supposed to become Murimu's savior, not a pirate's apprentice. Besides, his father was a respected man in society. The man did not give the boy time to think and said that, since he was now his student, they would skip the traditional bows and offer a drink instead. The young man began to protest, asking who had decided this and when, but one piercing glance from the man and the answer that he had decided was enough to understand that Hyun was in trouble. The boy was thrown into the water where he began to drown and babble, reminding him that his father was a deeply respected man, a former prince and teacher of the current heir, so he could not become a pirate. The old man asked him if his father was an official. Did that mean he couldn't become a pirate? Here, Hyun began to play the role of a decent son and say that if he became a pirate, he would disgrace his father, and could there be a worse son than that? The man thought for a moment and then sternly asked the young man if he should beat him. The old man said that he had heard from Kudok that the young man was a good swimmer, and that such talent could only be innate, so fate itself was telling him that he should become a pirate. Moreover, at such a young age, he had stood up to Jun-san. Such gems are born once in 1,000 years, and the king of the waters was not going to let him go. The argument was compelling, and Hyun could not turn away. The man rolled up his sleeves and said that he saw doubt in the boy's eyes and that there was nothing he could do but help him overcome it. Hyun was familiar with this situation from his past. All his teachers had beaten him, and now it was happening again. After finishing the noble beating, the man asked again what the young man had decided. The boy asked for a little more time to think. The pirate, with an old man's voice, hung him from a stump to kick him and buy some more time to think, and Hyun immediately cried out that he would become his student. The old man grumbled that he should have done so right away, and the young man puffed up, still deciding to become the man's disciple, even though he didn't have time for it. Despite the fact that this was compensation for the damage, Hyun decided to ask for something in return. First, he wanted it to be temporary because he still needed to find Hwang Deok-sam and get to the Cheonmu alliance. The king thought about the offer of temporary training, and the young man decided to try to pressure the man in order to get to the Cheonmu alliance faster. He said that if people found out that Hyun had become a pirate's apprentice, they would look down on him, and then he would become a frog who could only look at the Yangtze River, so he asked the old man to open the way for him. The young man said that this was so that he could gain experience and in the future be able to expand the Yangtze pirates to such an extent that they would capture the entire world. The old man was impressed. Even he, the strongest pirate chief, could not do such a thing. He was taken in by his promises and said that since he had already taken on such a student, he would have to be patient. However, he sternly warned that if the young man deceived him, he would not hesitate to destroy everything related to him. The man ordered Jong-san to tell all the pirates that from now on, Yu Hyun was the young master of Yangtze, but not a word about him was to be leaked to the outside world. He swore that if anyone found out about it, he would punish the culprit immediately. After being released, Hyun rowed down the river and cried, convincing himself that he had surrendered not because he had been beaten, but because it was his strategy, and that he would still subdue all the pirates who fell into the hands of the servant of chaos. And as soon as he ate the spiritual shell and spiritual grass, he would strike the old man down with a single blow. The old pirate was sitting quietly on a rock, sipping sake, when he heard someone calling him in a very offensive manner. Looking back, he saw his old friend Chang Sun calling him a damned water monster. He yelled at him, saying that he had warned the man not to touch his children. The Water King, looking at the man's angry gaze, began to say that he had misunderstood because he only found out later that his grandson was on the ship. Namgun said that he had learned about Sun on his way here and had even heard that the old man had cleared his circulation. Then the pirate had a logical question. Why the hell was the man slandering him if he knew that he had saved his grandson from madness and should be grateful for that? Chong-son wanted Hyun back and threatened to turn the Yangtze into a sea of blood if even a hair fell from the boy's head. The pirate asked if the boy was his student. Namgung said no, but after thinking about it, he changed his mind and said that he could be called that. The King of Water heard what he wanted to hear, but now the young man was his student, which created certain problems, so he asked what the man would do if he couldn't return Hyun to him. For a moment, Namgun Chongseon lost his temper, grabbed his sword, and even successfully attacked the old pirate. The old man, with a wound on his chest, jumped into the water to catch his breath because he had almost been sent to the other world. He shouted at his so-called friend, asking if he really intended to finish him off right there. Namgung was more confident than ever and said he wasn't joking and invited the man to come closer so he could cut off his excess hair. The pirate was not averse to fighting and seeing who would win, so he invited his opponent to attack. At that moment, Junsang approached with a boar on his shoulder and watched as the two old men argued over who would attack first. Finally, the pirate sighed heavily, realizing that they were just wasting time, and said that Hyun had long since sailed away and should be in Wuhan. Chang Seong asked if he had heard correctly and received confirmation. He knew that the old man was a scoundrel, but he would not lie. He put away his sword and thanked the man for saving his nephew. The pirate looked indignant because old Namgun had only just realized what was going on. The King of Waters waved his hand, picked up a cup of sake, and offered his old friend a drink before leaving to ease his mind. The man hesitated but finally thought, why not, as long as he knew that Hyun was okay. Meanwhile, Hyun, as always, ran into guards who did not understand his true status and held knives to his throat. He said directly that his name was Yu Hyun and that there must have been some misunderstanding. He was told that the union would decide whether it was a misunderstanding or not, but for now, they asked him to let them tie him up. The young man decided not to resist. He was going to the union anyway to talk to Hwang Do-sum. The young man was humble and was very surprised when they drove into the city. It was beautiful and gave the impression of being a forest created by pavilion. The man accompanying Hyun looked at him with a warm smile. He had heard that the young man had single-handedly defeated mountain bandits and even dealt with the Yangtze pirates. But when he looked at the street with enthusiasm, he looked like a boy of his own age. The young man himself was thinking at that moment how much people respected the head of Chongmu. Hyun fantasized about becoming the head of Cheongmu if he stopped the chaos and was appointed head as a reward. It would be nothing more than personal property in the Yu family, but by profession he would be the head of the Chongmu Union, respected by all of Murim. The boy had no better plan for his old age. But now his main task was to find that damn Hwang Do-sum and force him to reveal where the spiritual being was. The boy and the rest were led to a tall building where the Grand Advisor was doing his work. As soon as they entered, the young man immediately fell to his knees and saluted, frightened by the master. In addition to the advisor, the head of the union was also in the room, so the deputy head of the Green Dragon Squad, Pen Sonchan, greeted him. Turning around, the old gray-haired man smiled and invited Hyun to come in. It was the head of the union, Jongmu White Warrior Lee Hak-seon. His speech was soft and calm, but there was a sense of power in it. It was not a thirst for destruction, but simply the superiority of the stronger, which made people freeze in their tracks. The boy's teacher said that if Lee Hak-seon had survived, he would have led the fight, and then they would have had a chance to stop the chaos. Hyun greeted him with respect and introduced himself. The man immediately sensed that even though the young man was barely 17, his chi had already reached a level that was at least that of a master. He had the gaze of a dragon, and the man had heard rumors that the boy had met the King of the Waters. In front of the boy were two men, one of whom was Chagal Subom, his teacher's teacher, and the other was the head of the union, before whom even his teachers bowed. The boy felt as if he had fallen into a den of tigers, so he had to gather his thoughts. Subom spoke first and asked the boy if he was responsible for the chaos on the Yangtze River. The young man said that he was from the Yu family, and his father was close to the emperor, so he couldn't just stand by and watch pirates bully ordinary people. It turned out that the young man had fought for justice, which was acceptable, but the man asked who the middle-aged man was. Hyun did not immediately understand who he was talking about. Subo found it strange that the young man did not understand who he was talking about because eyewitnesses said that he had intervened in his dispute with the pirate. Putting everything together, the young man finally understood that they were talking about Hwang Do-sum. Of course, he had been interrogated, and obviously he had not confessed to what the young man was asking him about. Now he just had to come up with a convincing reason why he had intervened in the fight. Hyun decided to act cunningly and swung at a little girl who was pouring tea. Lee noticed this, grabbed the young man by the arm and sternly asked what this meant. Looking the old man in the eye, he said that was his answer. The man smiled, which meant that the young man had rushed into the fight without hesitation to save people. The man let go of this young man's hand, and Hyun smiled because he had come up with a convincing strategy. After deciding that he was driven by a thirst for justice, the young man asked what had happened to that man. Again, this was not the right question, as it seemed suspicious, but the young man assured him that he was not connected to him in any way, and there were rumors that he had used violence. Hyun got really mad, slammed his fist on the table, and said it was because he was angry that the man had endangered innocent people. The young man watched the men's reactions closely to see if they would fall for his game. Subom reported that the man was in custody and had been detained to question him about the cause of the incident. The young man was surprised when he was offered to meet with the man. It was such a reasonable offer that it seemed more like a trap. Sipping his tea, the young man thought that the men had decided to follow up on the interrogation and find out what his business with Hwang Do-sum was. Hyun decided to voluntarily take the bait, saying that of course he wanted to and was just about to ask for it. But everything had to go according to the young man's rules. He spoke, and Chagall looked at him sternly and suspiciously. He said he would warn the guard and the young man could come at any time. Hyun thanked him, thinking he would see how long the man could keep up his sly face. Finally, when the young man was about to leave, he was asked why the king, the tamer of waters, had spared him. He had expected this question. With a smile, Hyun said that they had agreed that he would compensate for the damage to the ships and the wounded. Lee Hoxon didn't believe it and hinted that they shouldn't be taken for fools, as the king would definitely have him killed. But the young man did not show any sign of fear and said with a smile that if they did not believe him, they could ask him personally. A vein bulged in the man's neck from anger at the boy's insolence. Hyun decided to joke a little, saying that if he had been caught, his hyper-protective father, Yu Seong-hwan, would have raised such a fuss. That explanation was enough for the time being, so the young man asked permission to leave. After the boy left the room, Subom turned to old Lee and asked how long they should believe these lies. The man did not know, so he said that probably as long as the young man was breathing. Both agreed that the boy was amazing because they could hardly feel any inner strength from him. Lee said that this child's dantian was empty. The man asked him if he meant that the young man was not hiding his naegong, but that he simply did not have any. But the old man said that this was not entirely true because he felt a slight recoil when he stopped the attack, so the young man was simply using a different place instead of dantian for spiritual practice. The man understood that the Sword King and the Tamer of Waters would not be interested in an ordinary child. The old man suggested keeping the boy for himself and said that he thought the boy could help Suba with one thing. The man unrolled a scroll and said that he planned to gather all the hidden dragons from around the world and unite them into a squad, but so far, things were not going very well. Hidden dragons are usually the heirs of certain families, young men who have not yet revealed their unusual talents, and it is quite difficult to get them out of there. Lee said that according to Dr. Namgung Seong, he would soon be able to break through to a new level when he came to his senses, and the King of Water had just helped him. What if we look at this as Yu Hyun's achievement, a young warrior who single-handedly fought pirates, protecting ordinary people, and even survived after clashing with the King of the Waters? A handsome guy from a well-known family, add to that another rumor, and it's perfect. Lee told Subo that Namgung Seong had risen to the level of a shining chi right next to Yu Hyun. Subom laughed, and the old man said that he had only given food for thought and that the rest was up to the man. First, Hyun visited his beloved nephew to check on the injured man. He looked, of course, like a young man from head to toe, covered in bandages. Suddenly, Dushin ran into the ward asking Sun on the fly if he had come to join the hidden dragons. But the boy froze when he saw the young Mr. Yu Hyun and greeted him. The young man was glad that now it was this scumbag's turn to run around as his servant, but he didn't know how to organize it. He couldn't just take it and beat him up, and on top of that, he had to find his other teachers. The young man began to read the scroll, saying that he knew Sun would also be interested in it, and that there were many other friends of his there. When Hyun heard their names, he instantly snatched the scroll from the young man's hands. Dushin wanted to politely refuse the young master's request to read it, because he was not allowed to do so, as only the heirs of the righteous clans of Murimu were allowed to join the squad. But he failed. Hyun was already reading the scroll, and all his damned scoundrel teachers were listed there. A smile lit up his face. For the boy, it was simply a gift from heaven. At that time, his future classmates, unaware of what awaited them, were training. Am Chansu from the Tan family was bitten by snakes once again. Won Hyun, the eternal sword of the Udan clan, was practicing holding heavy objects on the tip of his sword. Wan Gan, a Shaolin monk, meditated in a waterfall while enduring mental torture. Chagall Marin, the divine strategist, studied scrolls with stars that predicted bad energy for today, pelted with bottles of alcohol. This was what Hyun needed. Under the pretext of the hidden dragon, he was going to subjugate all the teachers. The thought of meeting them made his heart pound, and a chill ran down the skin of Dusin and Sun in the middle of a hot summer. With a smile, the young man came to the head of Chegal Suboma, and asked him to enroll him and son in the Hidden Dragon Squad.